The Thom Hartmann Program is brought to you in part by the Aiden Forecast, an investment newsletter with weekly updates of leading market indicators and a monthly deep dive into what the details of the economy and the markets mean for investors and retirees. On the web at aidenmarkets.com.
Wines have some of the highest pesticide levels in our food chain. This hour brought to you by ecowine.com. Pesticide-free wines, organic wines, imported from France by the Organic Wine Company, ecowine.com.
Hartmann Program is brought to you in part by Super Beets. Super Beets are sourced from non-GMO beets, and they're packed with dietary. Hartmann Program is brought to you in part by support for healthy blood pressure levels naturally. For more information, call 800-223-8242.
Or visit tomsbeats.com. It's the Thom Hartmann University Book Club. Today we're reading from Edmund Morgan's book, The Meaning of Independence, John Adams, George Washington, and Thomas Jefferson. It's a small book. It's anecdotes of the three presidents. I think he's a little harsh on Jefferson and a little too friendly about Adams, small quibbles. But it's a fascinating look into the founders of this country. And so today I'm going to read from the chapter on George Washington. The King of England, George III, was fond of farming. His favorite diversion was to ride about his lands, chatting with the tenants about the crops. Farmer George, he called himself. His arch opponent, George Washington, had the same fondness for farming. He too enjoyed riding about his lands and talking about the crops. Indeed, there was nothing else he enjoyed quite so much. But there the likeness ceased. And among the many other matters that differentiated King George Washington from George III, none was more striking than George Washington's greater reserve and dignity. George Washington would never have taken the liberty of calling himself Farmer George, nor would he have allowed anyone else to do so. Even his friends took care to keep their distance, and those who forgot to were apt to be brought up short. A familiar anecdote, though perhaps apocryphal, well illustrates Washington's customary posture toward himself and toward others. During a meeting of the Constitutional Convention in Philadelphia in 1787, a group of Washington's friends were remarking on his extraordinarily reserved and remote manner, even among his most intimate acquaintances. Governor Morris, who was always full of boldness and wit, had the nerve to disagree. He could be as familiar with Washington, he said, as with any of his other friends. Alexander Hamilton called his bluff by offering to provide a supper and wine for a dozen of them if Morris would, at the next reception Washington gave, simply walk up to him, gently slap him on the shoulder and say, "My dear General, how happy I am to see you look so well." On the appointed evening, a substantial number of people were already present when Morris arrived, walked up to Washington, bowed, shook hands, and then placed his left hand on Jefferson's shoulder and said, "My dear General, I am so happy to see you look so well." The response was immediate and icy. Washington reached up and removed the hand, stepped back, and fixed his eye in silence on Morris until Morris retreated, abashed, into the crowd. The company looked on in embarrassment, and no one ever tried it again. It seems a most un-American reaction, not the sort of thing that Americans like to see in the men they honor, certainly not the sort of thing one would look for in a leader of a popular revolution today. Yet Americans then and since have honored George Washington far beyond any other man in their history. Moreover, he earned the honor and his dignity and reserve. The aloofness that still separates him from us helped him to earn it. How this came about is part of the larger story of American independence, the story of how the American Revolution transformed some of the least lovable traits of a seemingly ordinary man into national assets. For besides his aloofness, Washington had other characteristics which at this distance appear less than admirable, but which served him and the nation well in the struggle for independence. Perhaps the most conspicuous of these traits, conspicuous at least in his surviving correspondence, was an unabashed concern for his own economic interest. Although Washington was fair in his dealings and did not ask favors of any man, he kept a constant, wary, and often cold eye on making a profit, ever suspicious, and not always without reason, that other men were trying to take advantage of him. Like most Virginia planters, he complained that London merchants were giving him too little for his tobacco or charging him too much for the goods he bought from them. When he rented to tenants, he demanded to be paid punctually and dismissed men's inability to meet their obligations as irresponsibility or knavery. If a man was so foolish as to try cheating him, he was capable of a fury that came through vividly in his letters, as when he wrote to one associate that, "All my concern is that I ever engaged myself in behalf of so ungrateful and dirty a fellow as you are." In operating his plantation at Mount Vernon, he inveighed endlessly against waste of time, waste of supplies, waste of money. "A penny saved is a penny got," he would say, or "many mickles make a muckle," by which he apparently meant that many small savings would add up to a larger one. Even in dealings with his mother, he was watchful, for he thought she had extravagant tastes. He was ready to supply her real wants, he said, but found her imaginary wants indefinite and oftentimes insatiable. Even after he left Mount Vernon in order to win a war and found a nation, his intense absorption with his estate persisted, somehow curiously out of place now and out of proportion to the historic events that he was grappling with. In the darkest hours of the war and later during some of the tensest national crises, he took time to write to the managers of his plantation about making it show a profit. In early December 1776, for example, after fleeing across the Delaware with the remnants of his army, he sent home instructions to make do without buying linen for the slaves, as a price is too heavy to be borne with. And while he was president, his weekly directives to his managers far exceeded in length the documents he prepared for his subordinates in government. No detail was too small for his attention. In December 1792, while his cabinet was rent by the feud between Jefferson and Hamilton, he sent orders that Anthony's, this is one of his slaves presumably, sore toe should be examined, and if it requires it, something should be done to it. Otherwise, as usual, it will serve him as apprentice to be in the house half the winter. 3 months later, when Hamilton was under attack in the House of Representatives for alleged corruption in the Treasury Department, Washington was worried that Caroline, who was never celebrated for her honesty, would steal some of the linen she was entrusted with cutting.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
And greetings, my friends, patriots, lovers of democracy, truth, and justice, believers in peace, freedom, and the American way. Thom Hartmann here with you, and on the line with us this morning to start our program, one of my favorite people in the United States Senate, one of the really fine progressive senators we have in the Democratic Party, Sherrod Brown. Senator Brown can be reached his website, brown.senate.gov. And you can tweet him at Sen, S-E-N, as in Senator, Sen Sherrod, S-H-E-R-R-O-D, Brown, B-R-O-W-N. Senator, welcome to the program. Welcome back to the program.
Good to be back, and I loved your commentary, and you got to come to Thom Hartmann to hear about the depth of P.T. Barnum. How cool is that?
Yeah, those book reports played while most of our stations are playing news, so most people don't hear that. But it was an interesting.
Well, that was their loss.
Yeah, but you know, the reason I read that book is because Donald Trump has said it's his favorite book. It's the only one he ever read, and it's so.
Seriously?
Yeah, and it's so completely inconsistent with the way he's lived his life. It's bizarre. So anyhow, but
how does he explain it, or did
no?
Why he likes it?
No, he never has. He just always said The Art of Money Getting by P.T. Barnum was his favorite book, and you know, it's like, you know, it's a self-help book written in the 1800s, and it could be Tony Robbins. But anyhow, in Ohio, you've got a case that could change who gets purged from the voting rolls. Your state, Ohio. What's going on here? Tell me about this.
It's happening in various degrees everywhere in the country. There is an aggressive move by Republican legislators in many states, and Ohio is one of the worst, by Republican secretaries of state where they are, and there are many states and Republicans control much of the machinery of state government, as you point out in your show, and by members of Congress, and it's just an assault on voting rights. I was Secretary of State, as you may remember, in the 80s, and we didn't know each other then, but when I was, one of the things we did, we were always looking for ways to expand the right to vote, and Republicans never really opposed it. We did things, you could register at unemployment bureaus, you could register at license bureaus, you could register your utility bill off, and they'd send a form. Or McDonald's Corporation printed 1 million tray liners for us that you're registered. When you go to McDonald's, they put that piece of paper on your tray, and it's a voter registration form. You could register. We did programs that every high school had. So, and now Republicans are in a position where they're aggressively trying to decide who should vote. And it's never about fraud. That's what they say. It's really about making sure that people of color, that young voters, that veterans just don't vote. They want to, so they can't win elections fairly, so they want to determine through gerrymandering and aggressive voter oppression whom they can close out from the voting rolls.
And let's not forget older people. I've had people call into this program talking about how their mother or father, who is now in their late 70s, 80s, no longer driving, their driver's license has expired, and when they show up at the polls, the poll workers say, you've got to have a valid ID. We will not let you vote because your driver's license has expired. What the hell is going on?
Yeah, and some states won't accept a student state university ID. They restrict. They you know, I don't make this comparison entirely, but you certainly remember what happened from the Grant administration, at the end of the Grant administration, after he left office, all the way into the 60s, when there'd be all kinds of barriers put up, from grandfather clauses to guess the number of peanuts in this jar sort of thing, to keep people from voting.
Oh, the literacy tests.
Yeah, the literacy tests. They're more. They're more sophisticated now, but it's the same kind of thing. They want to choose who the electorate is. I ask people, we are organizing a petition, SherrodBrown.com, to put an end to voter purging. We want people to join us, and it's an ongoing effort to push back on all the creative ways they are trying to deny people the right to vote.
I think it's a really interesting point that you made, that you started out with, essentially, which was back when you were Secretary of State in the 1980s. That would have been during the Reagan era. The Republican Party had not yet come out in public and said that they're really only courting upper middle class and wealthy white people, and that they're actively seeking to discourage pretty much everybody else from voting. They were doing that. You had Paul Weyrich in 1980 famously give his speech, when he was the co-founder of the Heritage Foundation and helping run the Reagan campaign, that, frankly, we don't want everyone to vote. Elections are not decided by the majority. They never have been in the history of our country. Quite candidly, our leverage in the election goes up as the voter populace goes down. That's a verbatim quote. But that was in 1980. It didn't get any publicity. Reagan was putting many of these policies into place, but it didn't get much publicity. But lately, the Republican Party has basically come right out and said, with Chris Kobach and all this other stuff, if you are young and therefore more likely to vote in a progressive direction, if you are elderly and concerned about your Social Security and Medicare, if you are a person of color and concerned about discrimination and lousy pay, if you're a woman and concerned about the fact that you're being paid less, we don't want you voting, thank you very much, unless you're a white woman in a middle-class suburb.
Yeah, and that's exactly right. In the 80s, there was resistance on some of our efforts. But think about it. If McDonald's was willing to do it, if your local utility company was willing to do it, if your state Department of Education and local high schools were willing to do it, and we don't even register by party in Ohio. You just register. You don't join a party until you vote in a primary. So there is no partisanship to registration, and there isn't most places. You can register any way you want, and there shouldn't be. And there was not 100% consensus. There were the outliers like Paul Weyrich, but the local Republican machinery and the local party activists, they weren't particularly hostile to registration. The South may have been different with the black vote and civil rights. Not that there aren't civil rights issues and discrimination, of course, in states everywhere in the North, but there wasn't this concerted Republican effort. The word has gone out to Republicans everywhere. Do what you can to select whom you want to be actually going to the polls and voting. And we know that, we know that young voters increasingly are drifting away, or maybe even dashing away from Republicanism. We know that people of color, most will never think of wanting to vote for Republicans now. We know all that. They know all that too. And as you said, they want to make sure that it's wealthy white people, older, wealthy white people, that they want to vote. And as you say, then if the numbers go down on voter turnout, Republican chances of winning go up. And if they'd only say that's why they want to do it, but they always talk fraud, and there is no real voter fraud. The fraud is, if there's any voter fraud, it's the people that are running the election systems and transporting the ballots and programming the computers. It's not some guy voting in Mansfield, Ohio, and then going to Zanesville and voting a second time. That just happens so rarely that it's not really consequential even in this.
Yeah, more people died from televisions falling on their heads in 2015 than were arrested for voting illegally. I mean, it's nuts.
How many people died from televisions falling?
I think it was 17 or 19 or 30. I don't remember the number now. I knew it at one time. I'm sorry.
Television fall on your head? How does that happen?
Probably most of them were television installers. There's a bunch of jobs that are more dangerous than being a cop. In fact, it's not even in the top 10.
Television installers to vote either, because they'd be working class voters.
There you go. So how far? Well, actually, before I get to that, Joe Stalin famously, perhaps apocryphally, but famously said, "It doesn't matter who votes; it matters who counts the votes." I would suggest to you that we've gone a big step beyond that. The Republicans are not only taking control of who counts the votes, the Have Act back in 2002, handing billions of dollars to the states to bring in these for-profit corporations who we later learned had clear Republican affiliations and preferences. Wally Odell's letter about turning Ohio out for George Bush, for example. He was the CEO of Diebold. So, not only have we privatized our votes, something that Thomas Paine must be rolling over in his grave over, but, and that kind of goes along with Joe Stalin, but also, oh, damn, we're hitting a break. I'm sorry. I missed the cue. Senator Sherrod Brown, we will continue this conversation another time. Thank you so much for being with us, sir.
Thanks. I really appreciate it. Thanks.
Keep up the great work. It's great talking with you. I really appreciate it. Senator Sherrod Brown, SherrodBrown.com. brown.senate.gov, and you can tweet him at Sen Sherrod Brown. We'll be right back.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
We'll be back with more of the news of the day and your calls after this. And welcome back. Jeff in San Francisco. Hey, Jeff, thanks for watching Free Speech TV. What's on your mind?
I was wondering, a quick question.
Jeff, can you take me off speakerphone? It sounds like you're in the bottom of a well.
Sorry, Tom.
Thank you.
I just want to ask about if you think the American Revolution was because the British banks were afraid of public banking, such in Pennsylvania. And Ben Franklin was big on this. He was called the father of paper money. And how we can return to this system. In a lot of countries have a lot of public banking, and how this could be returned probably first at the state level and eventually at the federal level.
Yeah, for people who don't know what you're talking about, Jeff, public banking is where the bank, instead of being a for-profit corporation that makes money off interest and loans and then distributes that money as profit to its shareholders and its senior executives, the bank instead is owned by a public institution, like a state, typically. North Dakota has a state-owned bank that was opened in, as I recall, 1909. It might have been in the 19-teens. And all of the profits that come from banking, and those profits are substantial. The big banks generate tens, if not hundreds of billions of dollars a year in profit. All of those profits are returned to the state and thus to the taxpayers of the state in the form of loans. North Dakota's was originally set up to give loans to farmers because the New York banks refused to do so. In the form of loans, in the form of profit statements, profits that go right into the state treasury, things like that. I'm a big fan of public banking, Jeff, and I think that every state should be doing this. If California did this, they'd have enough money to have single-payer health care, just from the profit of taking the money, taking the big bucks away from the New York banks. The New York banks have millions of dollars to spend, billions of dollars to spend on lobbyists, and so far that hasn't happened. But yes, I'm a supporter of public banking. To the issue of the American Revolution, your original question or your original point, I don't think that really was the issue. I think the issue from the point of view of the British was that they were viewing us as an extractive colony. That is to say, a colony that, number one, could provide them with cheap raw materials. We grew cotton here. It wasn't growing, cotton and tobacco. It wasn't growing in Europe at the time. They were having to import cotton from India by and large. And it was cheap coming from here. And they could sell things to us. They passed laws. There were actual laws on the books in the United States, British laws, prior to 1787. There were British laws, or 1883, the end of the Revolutionary War. There were British laws on the books that made it illegal for Americans to manufacture, for example, fine clothing. When George Washington was elected president of the United States, our first president post-Constitution, he wanted to wear an American-made suit to his inauguration. There was only one guy in the entire country who was making fine clothing. His name was Daniel Hinsdale, and he was in Delaware, and he was doing it illegally. And George Washington sent his friend Henry Knox on a horse to Delaware to get his suit. He took his measurements and took them to Daniel Hinsdale. Hinsdale made the suit, and Washington was sworn in wearing a brown suit made in America. For his famous painting, he put on British black, you know, the formal wear. But so that, I think, was the big issue. The Americans wanted to have control. We wanted to get control over our economy back, and the British wanted to maintain control over our economy. Banking would have been secondary or tertiary, as most of the banking that was going on in the United States prior to the American Revolution was British banks. So, Jeff, I understand the argument, but I am skeptical of it. We'll be right back. It's coming up on 20 minutes past the hour.
Hi, I'm Heather with Free Speech TV. Your support, whether through giving of donations, volunteering, or even spreading the word, has made it possible for the only independent progressive news network to sustain for more than 20 years. Now, you can give to Free Speech TV through the Branch of Gratitude. This program is a sustainable way to give that reduces waste through paper mailing, postage, and staff hours. By choosing to participate in the Branch of Gratitude, you are joining hands with the socially conscious community and sending a message to the world that Free Speech TV is not only here to stay, it is here to thrive. Please call 877-378-8669 or go online to freespeech.org. Make a difference and join the Branch of Gratitude today.
Back. Boy, a lot in the news, a lot going on in this country right now. You know, setting aside the weirdness of Donald Trump and Michael Wolff and all that, I realize you can't totally set it aside, but there are real issues that are being largely ignored because of the media circus around Donald Trump, who the big fan of P.T. Barnum. For example, Michael Phelan of Social Security Works sent this out a few days ago. He said, in a sneak attack on Social Security, Senate Republicans are proposing cuts to the Social Security Administration. This would result in delays in services and an erosion in confidence in the system. We must stop this backdoor attempt to dismantle our Social Security. here's the actual detail. In the new federal budget being voted on this month, Senate Republicans are proposing a $500 billion cut, $492 million cut to the Social Security Administration. This is on top of the billions Republicans have already underfunded the Social Security Administration this decade, which means longer wait times at Social Security offices, longer hold times when you call Social Security, and delays in millions of retirement, survivor, and disability claims. And SocialSecurityWorks.org, of course, is fighting this, number one. Number two, flu pandemic. I mentioned this the other day, how the flu virus really does well. It's highly contagious and easily transmissible when the air is lacking moisture, when you've got really dry air, which of course is every winter. As the temperatures go down and we turn on the heat in our houses, the humidity in the air vanishes because, because the outside air, it doesn't have as much moisture because it's colder, so the moisture precipitates out. That becomes our inside air. It starts out with less moisture, and then we heat it up, and of course the relative humidity drops, or the absolute humidity drops. So Michael Osterholm and Mark Olshaker over at the New York Times last week, actually it was earlier this week, it was on the 8th, wrote an article titled, "We're Not Ready for a Flu Pandemic." And this is where this ties in with trade policies and manufacturing policies. He writes, when a pandemic does strike, we will be in trouble, in part because American hospitals and pharmacies keep in stock no more than a few days' supply of most life-saving drugs, almost all of which are made in Asia. In fact, right now, the United States is largely out of Tamiflu, which is the drug that you give people when they have it's an antiviral. It's a drug you give people when they have a severe case of the flu. He continues, a 1918 type influenza pandemic could cause ruin on the order of what the Black Death did to 14th century Europe, but on a global scale, like the Black Death, such a pandemic would alter the course of world history. He says, we are not prepared. Our current vaccines are based on 1940s research. And once again, outside of the vaccines, pretty much everything is made outside of the United States. A brilliant piece by Nicholas Kristof in today's New York Times. I strongly recommend you check this out. Or actually, it was yesterday's Times. It's January 10th. It's titled Trump's Threat to Democracy. It's on the front page of the digital New York Times right now. And he points out a couple of political scientists. This is Stephen Levitsky and Daniel Ziblatt, both professors at Harvard. They just published a new book titled How Democracies Die. And in that book, they said that there are 4 warning signs when you're looking at a politician to indicate that that politician may become a Mussolini or a Hitler, that he may become or she may become an authoritarian destroyer of democracy. And those 4 criteria. Now, actually, before I tell you these criteria, let me give you the kind of backstory. He says, Stephen, the 2 professors, Harvard professors who wrote this book, write, a politician who meets even one of these criteria is cause for concern. With the exception of Richard Nixon, no major party presidential candidate, not even presidents, candidates, no major party presidential candidate met even one of these 4 criteria over the last century. So from 1900 till today, no presidential candidate, with the exception of Richard Nixon, met even one of these criteria, and Nixon only met one of the 4. Here's the criteria. Number 1, the leader shows only a weak commitment to democratic rules. Well, that's Donald Trump, right? Flaunting the rules, see what you can get away with, break the law. Number 2, he or she denies the legitimacy of opponents. Trump said Obama wasn't even born in the United States. He calls Hillary Clinton a criminal, Crooked Hillary, all this stuff. Number 3, he or she, rather than respecting the opponents, which is something even Nixon did. Number 3, he or she tolerates violence. Trump saying to people, hey, you know, rough them up a little bit and I'll pay your legal fees. Or saying to a convention of police officers, hey, stop putting your hands on people's heads when you put them in the car. Bang them around a little. Or words to that effect. And number 4, he or she shows some willingness to curb civil liberties or the media. Did you catch Trump's speech yesterday about how he wants to, quote, reform our nation's libel laws so that he can sue Michael Wolff, who wrote this book? I mean, that's what it's all about, right? These 4 criteria, the authors of this book say, again, with the exception of Richard Nixon, no major party candidate met even one. Nixon met only one. Unfortunately, Donald Trump meets them all. And they write in this book, How Democracies Die, that people who meet all 4 of these criteria are now ruling in Russia, the Philippines, Turkey, Venezuela, Ecuador, Hungary, Nicaragua, Sri Lanka, Ukraine, Poland, and Peru. And I would add Myanmar to that list. And here we are. Is this the road we're going down?
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-808-9925.
I mean, this is genuinely shocking stuff. We'll be back.
It's the Thom Hartmann University Book Club. Today we're reading from Naomi Klein's brilliant new book, This Changes Everything. This from the introduction. A voice came over the intercom. Would the passengers of Flight 3935, scheduled to depart Washington, D.C. for Charleston, South Carolina, kindly collect their carry-on luggage and get off the plane? They went down the stairs and gathered on the hot tarmac. Then they saw something unusual. The wheels of the U.S. Airways jet had sunk into the black pavement as if it was wet cement. The wheels were lodged so deep, in fact, that the truck that came to tow the plane away couldn't pry out loose. The airline had hoped that without the added weight of the plane's 35 passengers, the aircraft would be light enough to pull. It wasn't. Someone posted a picture. Why is my flight canceled? Because D.C. is so damn hot that our planes sank 4 inches into the pavement. Eventually, a larger, more powerful vehicle was brought in to tow the plane, and this time it worked. The plane finally took off 3 hours behind schedule. The spokesperson for the airline blamed the incident on very unusual temperatures. The temperatures in the summer of 2012 were indeed unusually hot, as they were the year before and the year before. And it's no mystery why this has been happening. The profligate burning of fossil fuels, the very thing that U.S. Airways was bound and determined to do, despite the inconvenience presented by a melting tarmac. This irony, the fact that the burning of fossil fuels is so radically changing our climate that it's getting in the way of our capacity to burn fossil fuels, did not stop the passengers of Flight 3935 from re-embarking and continuing their journeys. Nor was climate change mentioned in any of the major news coverage of the incident. I'm in no position to judge these passengers. All of us who live high consumer lifestyles, wherever we may happen to reside, are metaphorically passengers on Flight 3935. Faced with a crisis that threatens our survival as a species, our entire culture is continuing to do the very thing that caused the crisis, only with an extra dose of elbow grease behind it. Like the airline bringing in a truck with a more powerful engine to tow that plane, the global economy is upping the ante from conventional sources of fossil fuels to even dirtier and more dangerous versions. Bitumen from the Alberta tar sands, oil from deepwater drilling, gas from hydraulic fracking, coal from detonated mountains, and so on. Meanwhile, each supercharged natural disaster produces new irony-laden snapshots of a climate increasingly inhospitable to the very industries most responsible for its warming, like the 2013 historic floods in Calgary that forced the head offices of the oil companies mining the Alberta tar sands to go dark and send their employees home, while a train carrying flammable petroleum products teetered on the edge of a disintegrating rail bridge. Or the drought that hit the Mississippi River 1 year earlier, pushing water levels so low that barges loaded with coal and oil were unable to move for days while they waited for the Army Corps of Engineers to dredge a channel. They had to appropriate funds allocated to rebuild from the previous year's historic flooding along the same waterway. Or the coal-fired power plants in other parts of the country that were temporarily shut down because the waterways that they draw into cooler machinery were either too hot or too dry, or in some cases both. Living with this kind of cognitive dissonance is simply part of being alive in this jarring moment of history, when a crisis that we have been studiously ignoring is hitting us in the face. And yet we're doubling down on the stuff that caused the crisis in the first place. I denied climate change for longer than I care to admit. I knew it was happening, sure, and not like Donald Trump and the Tea Party years going on about how the continued existence of winter proves it's all a hoax. But I stayed pretty hazy on the details and only skimmed most of the news stories, especially the really scary ones. I told myself the science was too complicated and that the environmentalists, they're dealing with it. And I continued to behave as if there was nothing wrong with the shiny card in my wallet attesting to my elite frequent flyer status. A great many of us engage in this kind of climate change denial. We look for a split second and then we look away. Or we look but then turn it into a joke. More signs of the apocalypse, which is another way of looking away. Or we look but tell ourselves comforting stories about how humans are clever and will come up with a technological miracle that will safely suck the carbon out of the skies or magically turn down the heat of the sun, which I was to discover while researching this book is yet another way of looking away. Or we try to look, we look but try to be hyper-rational about it. Dollar for dollar, it's more efficient to focus on economic development than climate change, since wealth is the best protection from climate extremes, weather extremes. As if having a few more dollars will make much difference when your city is underwater, which is a way of looking away if you happen to be a policy wonk. Or we look but tell ourselves we're too busy to care about something so distant and abstract, even though we saw the water in the subways in New York City and the people on the rooftops in New Orleans, and know that no one is safe, the most vulnerable least of all. And though perfectly understandable, this too is a way of looking away. Or we look but tell ourselves that all we can do is focus on ourselves. Meditate and shop at farmers markets and stop driving. But forget trying to actually change the systems that are making the crisis inevitable, because that's too much bad energy and it'll never work. And at first it may appear as if we are looking, because many of these lifestyle changes are indeed part of the solution. But we still have one eye tightly shut. Or maybe we really look, but then inevitably we seem to forget. Remember and then forget again. Climate change is like that. It's hard to keep in your head for very long. We engage in this odd form of on-again, off-again ecological amnesia for perfectly rational reasons. We deny it because we fear that letting in the full reality of this crisis will change everything. And we are right. And the book is
this changes everything by Naomi Klein. Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you, and on the line with us is Dr. Trita Parsi. He is the founder and president of the National Iranian American Council, NIAC, the website naicouncil.org. You can tweet him at tparsi, P-A-R-S-I, or at NIA Council. And Dr. Parsi, welcome back to the program.
Thank you so much for having me.
It's been a while since we've talked, and you've posted several brilliant articles. There was one over at Common Dreams, I believe it was yesterday, that will Trump kill the Iran nuclear deal this week? If so, the threat of war grows. And then your piece in the American Conservative, America's relationship with Europe, collateral damage if Trump kills the Iran deal. What kind of damage can be done to the United States and to the world? I was going to say world peace, but I think this extends even way beyond that, if Trump blows up the Iran deal?
Well, we have to remember what the deal actually achieved and successfully achieved. It took two very bad scenarios off the table. It took the scenario of the Iranians getting a nuclear bomb off the table, and it took the scenario of the United States going to war with Iran off the table. Both of those scenarios come back onto the table if Donald Trump so recklessly decides to kill the deal, whether he does it directly by not renewing waivers this week, or if he does it indirectly by continuing this slow-paced sabotage of the deal that he has been engaged in for the last year.
Yeah. So what would be the consequence of that?
Well, so obviously, if there is a walkout of the deal and he starts to reimpose sanctions on European and other companies that are involved in the Iranian market, the Iranians will likely walk out of the deal. It'll restart other aspects of their program. The pressure for military strikes will grow again, just as it was a couple of years ago when we didn't have this deal. But there's a deeper problem that also emerges, and which I addressed in the article for the American Conservative. From the European perspective, they are now starting to look at Donald Trump and his attitude towards the nuclear deal not as simply yet another example of how he is, against much of what Obama stood for, but rather they're seeing a pattern in which Trump is trying to undo so much of what is the foundation of the international system with all of these different agreements and collaboration. It's not just the Iran deal. It's NATO. It's the Paris Agreement. It's UNESCO. He is going after so many of these different agreements, which seems to be a manifestation of his view of the idea of America first, which is America against the rest of the world. So rather than viewing the United States as a pillar of the global order, the United States has increasingly started to be viewed as a fifth column, seeking that global order's demise.
Yeah. And what does this say to countries with whom we are trying to negotiate new deals? For example, North Korea. Hey, we'd like to make a deal for you, get rid of your nuclear bombs. And then they look around and say, well, that worked out real well for Iran, right?
Absolutely. Why would any other country at this point strike a deal with the United States when Trump is so indifferent to whether he is living up to existing agreements or not? This is going to be a problem that goes beyond, of course, Iran or North Korea, although, of course, the North Korean situation is extremely dangerous and it would be extremely foolish to mess with it. But it's something that really shows that if the United States doesn't have credibility on the international scene, that no one actually wants to cut a deal with it, then it's going to be extremely difficult for the United States to be able to advance its own interests, but also very difficult for the United States to actually successfully be able to be seen as a leader in the international community, a country that other countries would follow.
What are the consequences to this for world peace? Or do you think that other countries will pick up the slack? I mean, we're not the only party to the Iran deal, for example. You've got, Russia, Germany, the UK, France, as I recall. I'm missing somebody. China?
Well, certainly, yes, China is there as well. And Germany.
In Germany, thank you.
there is, of course, there's plenty of other consequences to this, and there is an understanding at the end of the day that if the United States is going to go it alone all the time, you're going to start seeing other countries start to form alliances, not necessarily against the United States, but it's not going to be the way it was before, in which there was a desire in Europe, for instance, for the United States to be the leader of the world. We've always been knowing that at some point the world is going to start becoming much more multipolar, that the United States is going to lose some of its dominance. Well, that's happening much faster than it otherwise would have, precisely because of the way that Trump is handling many of these different things. But what is important to understand, even for those who perhaps would welcome the American dominance to be lessened, is that it is in these periods of transitioning from one type of a system, a unipolar system, to a different type of a system, in this case a multipolar system. Those transitions are extremely unstable. Those transitions tend to bring with them a tremendous amount of instability. And that's something people should pay attention to, because it's not going to be all particularly pleasant to be able to go through this transition.
Yeah. Let's talk about the genesis of this. I mean, we have extremely corrupt, hard right administrations in Israel with Netanyahu and in Saudi Arabia with Prince Mohammed bin Salman, and who both seem to be pushing to basically blow up Iran, if not, broadly speaking, if not the Iran deal to begin with. And then the other variable, it seems, or the other pressure on the Trump administration, was Donald Trump's own rantings on the campaign trail. And those didn't seem, I mean, I was observing the campaign as closely as anybody else. Those didn't seem to be rants that had really any basis in policy other than Barack Obama, the first black man in the White House. Oh, my God, that can't be possible. He must have been born in Kenya. Barack Obama negotiated America as part of that deal. So, A, correct me if you think I'm wrong on that, but how do these three dynamics, or these two dynamics, these two countries, and I'm assuming there's probably others, but those two are the more prominent, and again, correct me if you think I'm wrong in this analysis, and, Trump's campaign promises and his bizarre base, how does that all play into the probabilities of whatever might happen here?
Well, it is, of course, very important, and it shows that there is not necessarily one strategic thought behind what Trump is doing here. His motivations for opposing the nuclear deal seems to have shifted. Clearly, the origins of it was that he saw it as a politically useful thing to bash. He clearly seems to hate anything that has Obama's name on it. But by now, it's been convoluted with a whole set of other motivations and factors. You have the Israeli and the Saudi dimension. You have the dimension of several military people in Trump's inner circle who have essentially an obsession with revenge against Iran because of what happened in Iraq 10 years ago. So it's become much more complicated than it was before. But if anything still stands true, is that it's extremely difficult for any of these elements to be able to explain why killing the nuclear deal actually would be good for U.S. national interests and why it would be good for stability in the Middle East.
Yeah, it seems to me that it's a purely political thing. So what can Americans who are concerned about this, who want to see this administration, keep this deal intact for all the reasons that you and I have just discussed, what can Americans do?
Well, Americans can call their members of Congress and make sure that there is a clear communication to them that the American people do not want to have war in the Middle East again, and if there is a deal that is working, it should be kept. It should not be destroyed simply because of political wins that any specific element would like to see from that. I mean, people are literally playing with the lives of thousands of lives by playing these political games about this nuclear deal.
Yeah, I'd say millions.
Pressure on Congress is extremely important because Congress knows very well that the anti-war sentiment in the United States is a very potent political force. Yeah.
Two quick questions for the last minute and a half we have here. Number one, Iraq has become essentially an ally of Iran. No? And what does that mean for this deal, and what would that mean for this deal blowing up? Let me just leave it at that and ask you that question.
So if this deal were to be blown up by the United States, by Trump, and if this were to lead to a broader confrontation in the region, then certainly the landscape is one that is very complex and not necessarily particularly beneficial to the United States. Iran's influence in Iraq clearly is far greater than America's influence in Iraq. Yet the United States has soldiers there, it has troops there, it has assets and resources there. And one of the things that caused the Obama administration to view any military confrontation with Iran as a very, very negative prospect was precisely because of the very large number of targets the Iranians would have in the region and beyond if this were to lead to a military confrontation. Trump doesn't seem to be fully capable of grasping complex circumstances and mechanisms of that kind. So to him, this might be much easier simply because he doesn't understand it.
Yeah, so if it's not a bumper sticker, Trump can't talk about it, or can't grasp it?
That's not too far away from reality, I fear.
Yeah, this tragically seems to be what Michael Wolff's book is telling us, and what the people in the Trump administration are screaming at us. Although it's not just Trump; it's it's Bolton, it's all these neocons. I mean, it's quite remarkable. Dr. Trita Parsi, founder and president of the National Iranian American Council, NIAC. The website is niacouncil.org. You can tweet them at NIA Council. Dr. Parsi, it's always great talking with you. I'm always so informed by your perspectives. Thank you so much for being with us.
Thank you so much for having me.
Great talking with you. We'll be back.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann. Visit thomhartmann.com for audio and video archives.
And your calls right after this. And that is that Donald Trump is displaying all the characteristics of a despot, of a dictator, of a tyrant, of a person who not only does not respect the rule of law, but is willing to take down the 240-year traditions of a nation, in this case, this nation. Now, we have seen the rise of authoritarian governments in a bunch of different countries. We saw it in Russia. We saw it in the Philippines. We saw it in Turkey. We saw it in Venezuela. We saw it in Ecuador. We saw it in Hungary. Ecuador, I'd say, is kind of going backwards on that. But in any case, Hungary, in Nicaragua, in Sri Lanka, in Ukraine, in Poland, in Peru, in Myanmar, we have seen elected governments where people purported to be small d Democrats, that is, people who believe in democracy, rise to the level of president, and very often without even the support of the people or party, take over their country in ways that, a decade earlier nobody would have imagined was even possible. Nick Kristof writes, likewise the authors say, this is about the guys who wrote the book How Democracies Die, likewise, the authors say no more than 2% of Germans or Italians joined the Nazi or fascist parties before they gained power. Let that sink in for a minute. You've got Trump having power when, 23% of American voters, registered voters, are members of the Republican Party. In the case of Mussolini with his fascist party and Hitler with his Nazi party, when they took control of those governments, they only had 2% of the citizens members of their parties. So arguably the situation here is even more dangerous than it was in Germany and Italy in the early 1930s. Anyhow, Kristof says, likewise, the authors say no more than 2% of Germans or Italians joined the Nazi or fascist parties before they gained power. And early on, there doesn't seem to have been a clear majority support for authoritarianism in either Germany or Italy. But both Hitler and Mussolini were shrewd demagogues who benefited from the blindness of political insiders who accommodated them. In other words, it's not the tyrant. It's the politicians who are afraid to call out the tyrant and instead suck up to him. Republicans. Christoph goes on to say about Trump, he has tried to undermine institutions and referees of our political system. Judges, remember him calling Judge Curiel a Mexican judge? Judge Curiel, born in what, Ohio or Indiana? He's gone after the Justice Department, trying to diminish our perception of them as just. He's gone after law enforcement agencies like the FBI. He's gone after our intelligence community. It's the President of the United States attacking his own spies, attacking his own police. He's gone after the news media. He's gone after the opposition party. He's gone after Congress. As they write in the book, President Trump followed the electoral authoritarian script during his first year. He made efforts to capture the referees, sideline the key players who might halt him, and tilt the playing field. Amazing. It matters. It really matters. Read Christoph's piece in today's New York Times. It's brilliant. We'll be right back. Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you 10 minutes before the hour. We've got a lot on the table so far here today. Brent in Hilliard, Ohio. Hey, Brent, what's on your mind? Thanks for listening to SiriusXM.
Oh, thank you, Tom. So here's what's on my mind. I think there's obviously a chance that Donald Trump is going to blow up this Iran deal. And, you know, I am a progressive, so I agree with you, but I'm not certain that our acknowledgement of that, you know, oh, this is a change in how the world views America benefits us, simply because the people who voted for him want that change. They're embracing it. They're looking forward to it.
But you have to ask why, Brent.
Hey, it's coming.
No, you have to ask why. And the reason why the people who support Trump support blowing up the Iran deal is because for several years, the Iran deal was labeled as Obama's deal and thus was mercilessly and in a way that can only be called BS, attacked on Fox so-called news and right-wing hate radio, which is the principal news source for about 3/4 of that 23% of Americans who call themselves Republicans. And so they believed this BS, and now they are, aggressively pushing to, for Trump to do something because they think that somehow this deal was corrupt and we gave hundreds of billions of dollars to the Iranians and all this kind of stuff. All by and large either lies or distortions, but they believe it.
Well, I would like to push back a second because I think that's over-specific of what they want. I agree with everything that you said, but I think it's over-specific. I don't think they want to blow up the Iran deal specifically because it was Obama's. I think they want to blow up the idea that the United States is a player on the world stage. They want to go in their house, close their door, and be safe. I think they want to blow up all of those deals. NAFTA, TPP. I don't think they want to deal with North Korea. I don't think it's specific to Obama like some people seem to. I think they really are isolationists, these people.
Yeah. Yes. I mean, I don't disagree. The original America First movement was a movement to let Europe fall to Hitler. Basically, don't get involved with World War II. That was the original America First deal. And, with Charles Lindbergh and everybody else. And I don't disagree that these guys are anti-interventionists. And in fact, that's something at a certain level, that anti-interventionism appeals not only to many people, but to me as well. I mean, when Donald Trump on the campaign trail said no more stupid wars, I was like, hey, that's great. I believe Hillary Clinton started echoing his what he was saying. Maybe she was saying it first.
No smart diplomacy too.
But hang on, let me finish the thought there, though, Brent. But taking down our trade deals, specifically NAFTA, TPP, and I would say the WTO, our participation in the WTO, in my opinion, are good things. Those trade deals were negotiated for the benefit of transnational corporations that have no loyalty to any country, and to the extent to which countries actually manipulated those deals to their own benefit. Pretty much every other country in the world now imposes tariffs on American goods. They don't call them tariffs, they call them VAT taxes, but they functionally impose tariffs on our exports, and we don't have any mechanism to do that ourselves. We've become the village idiots. These trade deals have screwed the American workers. And like I was talking about with the flu, we don't even manufacture anti-flu drugs here in the United States any longer. And so, you know, surprise, surprise, if there's a major crisis, I mean, a civilization-changing crisis like the flu epidemic of 1918, we won't be able to get any drugs at all. People will stop flying because it's transporting the flu around the world, and so many people are dying from it.
Yeah, I'm not an isolationist at all. I'm actually a globalist.
Well, I'm all in favor of trade, Brent. I'm not in favor of the trade rules under which we're operating right now. We operated under trade rules prior to Reagan, essentially, that were largely not only beneficial to the United States, but beneficial to other countries as well, you know.
Sure, you're looking for fair trade, not necessarily free trade.
That's correct.
I mean, yeah, I'm on board with you there. And the other thing is, they wanted to get rid of stupid war. As a progressive, you want to get rid of stupid war and anti-interventionism with violence, and I agree with you there. But we don't want to stop international diplomacy.
No, of course not.
And these people want to stop internationalism across the board, whether it be smart diplomacy or violent action. They don't want any part of any of it. Unless they feel offended, and then they're absolutely willing to be violent. I mean, they flip the violent switch before the diplomacy switch.
No, I agree with you, Brent. And the question that we have to ask as Americans is this? I could only describe it as xenophobia. You know, fear of the other. Is this xenophobic worldview that is presented by Trump's Republican base? Is this the result of the vast majority of them, and I'm talking like well over 95%, never having traveled outside the United States? Keep in mind, only 4% of Americans have passports. And I'm guessing among Republicans, it's probably 1%. Is it the result of their being completely ignorant about the rest of the world? A, because they don't travel outside the United States, and B, because you can watch literally 4 or 5 hours of television news on any random day of the week and hear maybe one story about what's going on in the rest of the world. But by and large, but it won't be all that informative, and it'll be, you know, the scandal du jour or the horror story du jour. But people in the United States, by and large, are not informed about world events. You watch Agence France Presse 24, the French news service. You watch Deutsche Welle, the German news service. You watch RT, the Russian news service. You watch BBC, the British news service. Any of them in 1 hour will cover the entire world. That never happens on American television. Is that why?
Yes, and we have PBS World News Hour, and it should be mandatory starting in about 3rd or 4th grade.
But unfortunately, they've got like 3% of the TV viewing market in the United States, and none of them are Republicans. None of them. So.
Amen.
Yeah. Okay, Brent, we've been talking a long time here. I got to move along, but thank you for the call. Dominic in, I don't have a city for you, Dominic. Where are you?
Westchester.
Westchester, New York. Great. So what's on your mind today?
I'm calling from the, I guess, so-called conservative end that didn't vote for Trump, but also didn't believe the Iran deal was a good deal for the United States. And when you call BS, I'm confused. What's the lie? That we gave them money?
Right.
That they're going to do better by us now because we gave? I'm confused by, because I always consider
the 150
Iran
plus
not an ally.
Yeah. To answer your question, Dominic, real quickly, because we're hitting the end of the hour here. I'm sorry, but the simple thing is that we had frozen $150 billion worth of Iranian assets, money that the Iranians owned, that just by coincidence they had parked in American banks. We froze that for decades. And we gave that money back to them in exchange for stopping their nuclear deal. That's not giving them money. That's their own money.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann.
The Thom Hartmann Program is brought to you in part by the Aiden Forecast, an investment newsletter with weekly updates of leading market indicators and a monthly deep dive into what the details of the economy and the markets mean for investors and retirees. On the web at aidenmarkets.com.
Wines have some of the highest pesticide levels in our food chain. This hour brought to you by ecowine.com. Pesticide-free wines, organic wines, imported from France by the Organic Wine Company, ecowine.com.
Hartmann Program is brought to you in part by Super Beets. Super Beets are sourced from non-GMO beets, and they're packed with dietary nitrates, helping to produce nitric oxide for more energy, stamina, and support for healthy blood pressure levels naturally. For more information, call 800-223-8242
or visit tomsbeets.com.
The Thom Hartmann University Book Club today, we're reading from League of the Iroquois by Lewis Henry Morgan. This was first published in 1851, the same decade that Charles Darwin published Origin of Species. This was a big deal at the time. And when there were still, Iroquois to be talked with and whatnot. So this is, living the way that they were living. So this is from page 89, Structure of the League. This is just basically how the Iroquois Confederacy was put together in kind of an anthropological perspective. In connection with the power of the tribes to designate the sachems, those are the wise elders, should be noticed the equal power of deposition. If by misconduct a sachem lost the confidence and respect of his tribe and became unworthy of authority, a tribal council at once deposed him. Having selected a successor, summoned a council of the league to perform the ceremony of his investiture. Still further to illustrate the characteristics of the tribes of the Iroquois, some reference to their mode of bestowing names would not be inapt. Soon after the birth of an infant, the near relatives of the same tribe select a name. At the first subsequent council of the nation, the birth and name are publicly announced, together with the name and tribe of the father and the name and tribe of the mother. In each nation, the proper names were so strongly marked by a tribal peculiarity that the tribe of the individual could usually be determined from the name alone. Making as they did a part of their language, they were all significant. When an individual was raised up as a sachem, his original name was laid aside and that of the sachemships was itself assumed. In like manner, at the raising up of a chief, the council of the nation, which performed the ceremony, took away the former name of the incipient chief and assigned him a new one, perhaps like Napoleon's titles, commemorative of the event which led to its bestowment. Thus, when the celebrated Red Jacket was elevated by election to the dignity of a chief, its original name, O Titai Nani I, always ready, was taken from him, and in his place was bestowed Sagoye Wat Ha, keeper awake, in allusion to the powers of his eloquence. Each tribe in the nation thus formed a species of separate community. The members of all were all of consanguinity, and all their relationships are easily traced. In like manner, those of the same tribe in each of the other nations were their consanguinee, and their relationships, near and remote, were also traceable. As two tribes were necessarily joined in each family, there was a perfect diffusion of tribes throughout the nation and throughout the league. So whenever somebody got married, they had to marry somebody from a different tribe. It's remarkable. In this manner, the race of the Iroquois, although consisting of different nations, was blended into one people. The league was in effect established and rested for its stability upon the natural faith of kindred. It now remains to define a tribe of the Haudenosaunee of the Iroquois. From the preceding considerations, it sufficiently appears that it was not, like the Grecian and Roman, a circular group of families, for two tribes were necessarily represented in every family. Neither, like the Jewish, was it constituted of the lineal descendants of a common father. On the contrary, or mother, excuse me. On the contrary, it distinctly involved the idea of descent from a common mother. Nor has it any resemblance to the Scottish clan or the Canton or the Switzer. In the formation of an Iroquois tribe, a portion was taken from many households and bound together by a tribal bond. The wife, her children, and her descendants in the female line would in perpetuity be linked to the destinies of her own tribe, while the husband, his brother and sisters, and the descendants of the latter in the female line would, in like manner, be united to another tribe and led by its affiliates, or affinities, excuse me. Herein was a bond of union between the several tribes of the same nation, corresponding in some degree with the cross relationship founded upon consanguinity, which bound together the tribes of the same emblem in the different nations. The Iroquois claim to have originated the idea of a division of the people into tribes as a means of creating new relationships by which to bind the people more firmly together. It is further asserted by them that they forced or introduced this social organization among the Cherokees, the Chippeways, the Mississaugas, and several other Indian nations with whom in ancient times they were in constant intercourse. The fact that this division of the people of the same nation into tribes does not prevail generally among our Indian races favors the assertion of the Iroquois. On the other hand, the laws of descent, at least of the crown, among the Aztecs, dimly shadows forth the existence of a similar social organization, which may have been reproduced among the Iroquois or preserved through a remote affinity of blood. At all events, it was the life and strength of the Iroquois League. Of the comparative value of these institutions when contrasted with those of civilized country and of their capability of elevating the race, it is not necessary here to inquire. It was the boast of the Iroquois that the great object of their confederacy was peace, to break up the spirit of perpetual warfare which had wasted the red race from age to age. Such an insight into the true end of all legitimate government by those who constructed this tribal league excites as great surprise as admiration. It is the highest and noblest aspect in which human institutions can be viewed, and the thought itself, universal peace among Indian races, possible of attainment, was a ray of intellect from no ordinary mind. To consummate such a purpose, the Iroquois nation were to be concentrated into one political fraternity, in a manner effectively to prevent offshoots and secessions. By its natural growth, this fraternity would accumulate sufficient power, and then they go on by affiliation to merge everything into one common family. A remarkable book written in 1851, League of the Iroquois, Lewis Henry Morgan.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you, and on the line with us, Professor Richard Wolff, the economist, co-founder of Democracy at Work, author most recently of Capitalism's Crisis Deepens, Essays on the Global Economic Meltdown. Professor Wolff, pardon? Oh. Professor Wolff, welcome to the program.
Thank you, Tom. Glad to be here.
Oh, I'm sorry. There's a bunch of stuff in the news right now. The Trump administration waives punishment for convicted banks, including Deutsche Bank, which Trump owes millions to. Can you tell me about this?
Yes, it's really an astonishing kind of story. If you look back since the late 1990s, Donald Trump, in his various retail and real estate ventures, has had to borrow huge amounts of money from banks. Because he went bankrupt repeatedly, large numbers of those banks got burnt and basically refused to do business with him. One of those who saw into the future, perhaps, that decided to step in where other banks hesitated was the leading German bank known as Deutsche Bank. And so over the years, they have lent Donald Trump and his ventures billions, that's with a B, billions of dollars, and he currently owes them because they also had their troubles, these loans, and there were problems between Trump and Deutsche Bank. But they worked those things out. They made enough money, both of them, to get around various rules and laws. And currently, the estimate of the New York Times and others is that Trump owes them in the neighborhood of $300 or $400 million. Why is this important? Because last week, once again, the American government, and Trump, by the way, is not alone in doing this, Obama did it also, provided all kinds of special exemptions to the Deutsche Bank so that it would not have to pay as much, or it wouldn't have to pay as soon, or it wouldn't have to pay at all some of the penalties that were imposed on that bank for basically having violated every major rule governing banking. That is, the Deutsche Bank has been found guilty of money laundering for illegal or corrupt maneuvers, particularly with Russia. They've been part of the LIBOR scandal of banks setting interest rates in ways that would make them money and cost all the rest of us extra on our credit, for having been badly burnt in mishandling the mortgage crisis that led to the collapse of 2008. Deutsche Bank is guilty of all of that. And then last week, the Trump administration gave them a pass on some of the various penalties and so forth they've been assessed for doing these bad things. And of course, the question arises everywhere in the world, is Mr. Trump and his administration going lightly on this bank because he owes them money and they will give him a nice break when the time comes, maybe when the limelight isn't on him? It is a very smelly conflict of interest at the very least.
Yeah, it seems remarkable. Meanwhile, the government of China announced, or sort of announced, I'm getting mixed messages on this, day before yesterday, I believe it was, that they were going to dial back their purchases of U.S. bonds and even suggested, or seemed to suggest, that they were going to start selling U.S. bonds and get them out of their portfolio. There was a headline in the Financial Times, I believe it was, U.S. government bond sell-off triggers warnings. Is that the consequence of this? U.S. stocks, bond dollar lower on China Treasury buying jitters. What's the story here? What does and how does this matter to the average American, particularly the average American who may have a 401k?
Well, I can tell you that there's a number of ways of answering that, but let's start with, again, the Trump administration. They just pushed through, as you all know, an enormous tax cut for business. It'll be too difficult politically to pay for that by cutting massively social programs like Social Security, Medicare, Medicaid, and so on. So what the government is likely to do is go in and borrow a lot of money to make up so they can do what they have to do for the money they're no longer taxing from big corporations. That means the government will be a big, heavy borrower for years into the future. Now here comes China. China is the biggest creditor of the United States. That is, the Chinese People's Republic of China has lent more money to Uncle Sam than any other country. It's measured in the trillions, et cetera, et cetera. If the Chinese have decided that further lending to the United States, since they already have lent so much, is not a good idea for them for all kinds of reasons, we have a real problem because the American government has to borrow, and their single largest creditor of recent decades is going to be, or seems to be, unwilling to lend. The way that little story ends is that the government of the United States, in order to borrow, will have to persuade other people, other than the Chinese, to step in and loan the money. And the only way you can get them to do that is to raise interest rates. And that means the mortgages we all have in America, the car payments we all have to make, the credit card payments we make, our children's college debt that they have to cover, all of the costs of that will go up. So it'll affect every single person listening to this conversation if indeed the Chinese have made that kind of decision.
So what evidence do we have that they did or that they didn't? The news reports I've read seem ambiguous or contradictory.
Well, I think the Chinese themselves have to worry about it. You know, if they don't lend, if interest rates go up, if that makes the American economy stumble in ways that a lot of people are afraid it might, and not just the American economy, but other economies, the European and Japanese, who have been having this quantitative easing, this easy money situation now for many years, then the Chinese stand to lose. Their economy still depends on the West buying everything they produce, or almost everything they produce, and therefore it's a kind of a dicey problem for them. They want to protect themselves against the decline of the United States. On the other hand, they don't want to get burnt by that decline, and they walk a tightrope between whether protecting themselves in the short run by getting rid of the dollars they own, the debts of the United States that they own, Is that a good idea, or will that contribute to an economic downturn that can hurt them in other ways? That's why they haven't acted on this situation in the past. But everybody who follows this realizes that at some point there'll be a tipping point, and they will decide that the decline in the United States is so scary that it'd be safer for them to stop lending or even to unload the debts that they already own rather than accumulating more of them. And the jitteriness you feel and the mixed messages you're getting are because of the anxiety that we might be at or near that tipping point.
Yeah, we have about 30 seconds left. Isn't this a weapon that the Chinese could use against us if, for example, we got in a conflict with them over the Spratly Islands or over trade?
Oh, they not only can they already have. Everybody in the world who pays attention knows that if the United States goes beyond a certain point of verbal this or that about China and actually begins to threaten them, they have mammoth weapons with which to respond and punish the United States. Not the least of those is the fact that they could unload a quantity of dollars that would make the value of the dollar very, very shaky. That's within the power of the People's Republic of China to do, and it disciplines what the Americans can do beyond saber-rattling and verbiage because of what might happen in the way of a Chinese response.
Remarkable. Professor Richard Wolff. Prof. Wolff is the Twitter handle. democracyatwork.info is the website. Thank you, sir.
My pleasure, Tom. Take care.
This
Thanks.
is the Thom Hartmann Program.
We'll be right back with more of the news of the day and your calls in just a moment. And welcome back. Charlie in Glendale, Arizona. Hey, Charlie, what's on your mind today?
Hey, hold on. Let me get you off. My question is, has Iran lived up to the agreement?
Yeah. Donald Trump certified that they did 5 months ago. Excuse me, 2.5 months ago.
Okay, so Iran is living up to all what they want.
In every way, yes. Iran has 100% kept their end of the deal. As I said, the President of the United States, Donald Trump, as much as it pains me to say that, certified that 2.5 months ago. He's going to have to certify it again at the end of this month. And because Congress said that it has to be certified every 3 months, 4 times a year, and which is something I think they should do away with because it just turns it into a political football. But yes, not only has has Donald Trump said that the Iranians are keeping up their side of the deal, but so have the governments of Russia, of Germany, of Great Britain, of France, and of China, the other countries that were signatories to the deal. It's not just us who made the deal, and it's not just us who are the gatekeepers of the deal or the overseers of the deal, shall we say. Everybody agrees that the Iranians have kept their end of the deal. We may not like what they're doing with Hezbollah in Lebanon, for example, but they have kept their end of the deal.
Okay. But we're not the gatekeepers of that deal, right?
No, it's the other 5 countries and us, and arguably the United Nations. I mean, this was all done under within the framework of the United Nations. It wasn't worked out at the UN. It was worked out as a 6 countries versus Iran kind of deal, but it was done with the approval of the United Nations, and so broadly speaking, yeah.
Okay, and then the last thing is, I'm average white guy. Charlie Smith, why would they eliminate me off a voter roll because my name is Smith or Johnson?
If Smith and Johnson might be at some risk, basically what Chris Kobach is doing is comparing across the nation, taking all the states that he has information on, and I think it's around 30 of them right now, mostly Republican states, and you're in Arizona, so you're in a state where he's doing this, and saying that if there's a Charlie Smith in Arizona and there's a Charlie Smith in Texas, obviously that's somebody who's voting in 2 states. He's hopping on a plane on Election Day and casting 2 votes. And so they throw you both off the voting rolls. The frequency, there are a couple, Smith and Johnson are among them. There's 4 or 5 fairly common names for Caucasians, and they're old British names by and large. There are many more common names. You know, the density of common names among the white population is around, and I please don't quote my absolute number on this. This is just kind of for illustration purposes. I had the numbers like, you know, a year ago when we first did this story, but let's say it's around 4 or 5% of Caucasian Americans have common names, because most of those common names, again, came through England. But the reality is that Caucasian Americans came from Serbia, they came from Germany, they came from France, they came from Norway, you know, et cetera, et cetera. So there's a broad variety in Caucasian names. African Americans, there's far less diversity in their names, in large part because a lot of former slaves adopted their slave owners' names or the names of presidents of the United States, Madison, Jackson, Washington, Jackson, et cetera. And similarly, among Hispanics and among Asians, there's very, very little diversity of names. And so if you just knock out all the common names, you're going to pick out a Charlie Smith and a John Johnson. But you're definitely going to radically reduce the number of those minorities. Charlie, thanks for the call.
This year's election results have generated fear, sadness, and despair.
In the days and months ahead,
our democracy may face a crisis of historic proportions.
But there is good news.
There is good news.
There is good news. Thousands of people are stepping forward in solidarity,
resistance,
and resolve.
We join them.
We join them.
We join them.
In standing with the most vulnerable communities among us.
Those most likely to be targeted by new restrictions and policies.
We will tell their stories here.
Here
on Free Speech TV.
We will lift their voices here
on Free Speech TV.
In the difficult times ahead, know that we will be with you
24 hours a day.
Every day.
You are not alone.
You are not alone.
You are not alone.
There are millions of us.
Raising our voices and hearts together as one.
We've got your back.
We got your back.
Free Speech TV's got your back.
The revolution is in progress.
Hartmann here with you. And a number of other things in the news, too, that I wanted to talk about that have to do with the economy, things we didn't have an opportunity to get into with Professor Wolf. Walmart has announced, hey, we're giving a $1,000 bonus to our employees because we got a tax break. And, of course, that gets, you know, repeated over and over again ad nauseum on Fox So-Called News and on Right Wing Hate Radio. What they don't point out is that only Walmart employees who have worked at Walmart for 20 years or more are eligible for that $1,000, which would be, in all probability, mostly management, because Walmart has huge turnover among the lower paid employees. It turns out, in fact, that the bonus that they're giving represents about 2% of the value of the tax cut that Walmart just got. And if you put it over a 10-year period, which, you know, I mean, the tax cut is forever, actually. If you put it over a 10-year period, it's 0.009% of the value of the, well, actually, that 0.009 is the value of the tax cuts to corporate America over 10 years for all 55 companies that have now announced bonuses. So isn't this a sweet deal? You get billions of dollars from the federal government, and for every dollar you get, you give back 9 cents to your employees. Actually, it would be for every 10, because it's 0.09%. For every $10 you get, you give 9 cents to your employees, and you keep the $9.90 for yourself. But somehow, people who watch Fox News and listen to Right Wing Hate Radio think that this tax cut is going to give them, wow, I get a bonus from Walmart? Wow, this is great. Yeah, you're going to pay for it with your taxes. Or you're going to pay, actually, you're not going to pay for it with your taxes because, yeah, it's a broad tax cut. You're going to pay for it by no longer having Medicare, no longer having Medicaid, no longer having Social Security. Yes, the Republicans are trying to defund Social Security to the tune of $460 million. It's in their budget, which they're going to vote on sometime this week or next. It's right there. As Bernie Sanders repeatedly points out, and I quote, Today, the top 1% owns 41% of the financial wealth of America. The bottom 60% owns 1.7%. 1%. In fact, the top 1/10 of 1% of Americans owns almost as much wealth as the bottom 90% of the American people. But that income, that wealth, is, even among the rich, is not evenly distributed geographically. Here's an interesting juxtaposition. Just compare these two things. Number one, we all know what happened to Kansas. Sam Brownback said, I'm going to do an experiment. I'm going to prove Reaganomics and trickle-down economics is not just turning America into a nation of peons, but actually works. So we're going to radically cut taxes on billionaires, on multimillionaires, and on big corporations in Kansas. We're going to lower the tax rate to 0 for some of these companies and for some of these people. And we're going to give them huge tax breaks, and I'm going to prove to you, Sam Brownback said, in a public press conference. This was years ago, 3, 4 years ago, 5 years ago. He said, I'm going to prove to you that Reaganomics works and that these tax cuts are going to stimulate the economy. Kansas is going to become the best economy in America. He did the tax cuts, and what happened? Kansas went in the total crapper. They fell apart. They had to, within a year, Sam Brownback was cutting hundreds of millions of dollars out of his education budget. He was closing schools. He was laying off teachers. I mean, right across the board, all across Kansas, public services were hit. They were not able to expand Medicaid. I mean, it crippled Kansas when Sam Brownback did that. And then Iowa. Iowa in the last couple of years, the last decade or so, has gone from having a legislature that had some Democrats in it, or the legislature would go back and forth, to being entirely under Republican control. And so here comes the news. This is from iowastartingline.com, a local Iowa news source. Very bad news this week for both Governor Kim Reynolds and the Republican-controlled Iowa legislature. The U.S. Bureau of Economic Analysis, the BEA, reported the second quarter economic growth by state GDP. Iowa's economic growth was a negative 0.7%, dead last among all 50 states. Of the 50 states, 48 had positive growth. Only Iowa and South Dakota had a negative growth rate, both Republican states. They say it's a huge embarrassment for the Iowa Republican Party, the Republican governor, and the GOP-controlled majorities in both branches of the legislature, and have driven Iowa's economy to last place in the nation. They can't blame the Democrats for this economic disaster. This latest, again, this is an Iowa newspaper, the latest, or an Iowa website. The latest economic data simply confirms what most Iowans already know. Republicans' mismanagement of state government has led Iowa to a budget train wreck. Under their management, they have taken a budget surplus of nearly $1 billion in 2013, when you had Democrats in control of at least one branch of the Iowa government. A budget surplus of nearly $1 billion in 2013 to a budget deficit this past year. In the Reynolds regime struggle to balance the state budget this past year, they slashed spending by $118 million and ended up borrowing another $144 million to end the budget year. Meanwhile, what's happening in California, the highest taxed state in the nation? Jerry Brown just announced that they've got a $6.1 billion budget surplus. California is doing great. They're throwing hundreds of billions of dollars into their rainy day fund. It's amazing. Progressivism works.
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-808-9925.
And what they call conservatism, what I'd call corporatism, just basically screws everybody except the really, really rich.
And welcome back to our Thom Hartmann University Book Club. Today we're reading from Devil's Bargain by Joshua Green, the subtitle Steve Bannon, Donald Trump, and the Storming of the Presidency. This is from the afterword, the very last chapter. It's titled Kali Yuga, which in Hinduism is when the earth goes into a phase of destruction. In the shell-shocked aftermath of the election, President Obama, looking shaken, appeared in the White House Rose Garden to deliver public remarks intended to project a sense of calm. A sense, really, that the basic stability of our country remained intact. Sun is up, Obama said. I know everybody had a long night. I did as well.
Had a chance to talk to President-elect Trump last night about 3:30 in the morning, I think it was, to congratulate him on winning the election. End of quote. The next day, when the two men appeared together in the Oval Office, it felt as if the world had slipped through the looking glass. Trump quickly named Bannon his chief White House strategist. Republicans controlled every branch of government. With Trump's ability to defy every political norm, anything seemed possible. Who could argue otherwise after what had just transpired? And yet, within days of his inauguration, Trump's White House was plunged into chaos and scandal from which it has not recovered and may never. Bannon, the imaginative reconceiver of U.S. politics, hung streams of paper listing Trump's promises from the walls of his West Wing office. His strategy, as always, was to launch furious attacks, this time to, quote, shock the system, end quote, and rapidly reorient the federal government in a more nationalist direction. He called this, with what I took to be intentional irony, a shock and awe approach to asserting Trump's power. But Trump's flurry of activity quickly ran into problems. There was his executive order, sprung a week after his inauguration, banning immigrants from 7 majority Muslim countries, which set off nationwide protests and was blocked by the courts. His firing 2 weeks later of National Security Director Michael Flynn for contacts with the Russians. The collapse of his first major legislative initiative, a bill to repeal Obamacare. His firing of FBI Director James Comey. And the swift descent of the West Wing into a viper's nest of backstabbing and leaks. This quick turn toward a crack-up was hardly unforeseeable or even altogether surprising, but it contrasted sharply with the success of a candidate who had dominated his opponents, shaped news coverage, and shown himself to be all but impervious to the forces that overwhelm other politicians. Bannon, whose wild gambits in the campaign had invariably paid off, seemed to run out of magic tricks when Hillary Clinton was no longer a target. The government wasn't as malleable to Trump and Bannon's aggressions as the Republican Party and the cable news channels had been, and they found themselves consistently thwarted and undermined by the courts, by right-wing hardliners in Congress, by their own inexperience and Trump's errant tweets, and by the bureaucracy they were now overseeing. The crises these failures precipitated in the White House cost Bannon much of his influence and soon threatened Trump's presidency. While it's still early in his term, the possibilities that Trump's most ardent supporters once imagined for his presidency already seem to be mostly foreclosed. I think there are 3 main reasons why Trump's administration has so quickly fallen into disorder and confusion. Number 1, Trump thought being president was about asserting dominance. Just after he'd locked up the GOP nominations, Trump said something to me that crystallized his view of politics and explains, to my mind, much of his subsequent difficulties. Quote, I deal with people that are very extraordinarily talented people, he told me. I deal with Steve Wynn. I deal with Carl Icahn. I deal with killers that blow these politicians away. It's not even the same category. This, he meant politics. This is a category that's like 19 levels lower. You understand what I'm saying? Brilliant killers. Trump was equating politics with business and the presidency with the job of being a big-shot CEO, a killer. He filled the upper ranks of his administration with people of a similar mindset. Gary Cohn, Wilbur Ross, Steve Bannon, aggressive, domineering men accustomed to getting their way by dint of their position. None had government experience, nor did many others in the West Wing. So none anticipated the problems this approach to governing would cause. Trump's self-conception as the all-powerful apprentice boss blinded him to a fundamental truth of the modern presidency, that the president needs Congress more than the Congress needs the president. Trump's domineering instinct served him poorly, since most members of Congress are secure in their jobs and accountable mainly to their own constituents. And it backfired disastrously when Trump fired Comey after he refused to submit to a pledge of loyalty to his boss. Number 2, Trump ran against the Republican Party, Wall Street, and Paul Ryan, but then took up their agenda. Populists often struggle to govern, but Trump scarcely attempted to lead the populist revolution that he promised. In May, he told me he would transform the Republican Party into a workers' party. But while he kept voicing populist shibboleths, the legislative agenda he took up was the standard conservative fare pushed by Paul Ryan. During the GOP primary, Trump has shrewdly sensed its weak point, Ryan's desire to finance tax cuts for the rich by cutting programs like Social Security and Medicaid, harmed the party's white blue-collar base. Trump told me he'd made this point to Ryan directly. He
said, quote, "There's no way a Republican is going to beat a Democrat when the Republican is saying we're going to cut your Social Security, and the Democrat is saying we're going to keep it and give you more." The book is Devil's Bargain by Joshua Green, Steve Bannon, Donald Trump, and the Storm for President.
Hartmann Podcast at thomhartmann.com/podcast. They're commercial free, and you can listen anytime, any place you want. Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you, and our newest member of the family, Chewy, is in the studio with us. A little 6 months, 6 weeks, 8 weeks, 10 weeks. How old is Chewy, Louise? 12 weeks. Okay, this is our 12-week dog. She's part miniature Australian Shepherd and part poodle and who knows what all. Anyhow, she is here with us. We have a poll. This was Nigel put this poll up for our YouTube community, and the poll asked the question: Trump blasts courts after DACA Dreamers ruling. Trump said the court system was broken and unfair. Should Trump respect the courts? 64% of you said yes. 2% of you said yes, that's an absolute. 4% of you said yes, but only if the court agrees with his opinion. 7% said no, Trump can publicly disrespect the courts if he wants. And 27% said the court system is broken. Very interesting. Very interesting. Just to finish up on Jerry Brown's legacy, this $6 billion budget surplus in California, while Republican state after Republican state continues to collapse in terms of quality of life. In most Republican states, there's no expansion of Medicaid. So if you work for a living, but you make less than, say, $15 an hour, our odds are, A, you can't afford any health care at all, and B, the state's not going to help you out. Working people in Republican states are screwed. I mean, they all know that. Everybody knows that. But, you know, just to put a fine point on it. Not so in California. Of course, California expanded Medicaid. California has, you know, no massive deficits. In fact, it's the exact opposite. This is in the Wall Street Journal. The right-wing Wall Street Journal. Buoyed by tax increases passed under his administration, Mr. Brown said Wednesday that the state is projecting a $6.1 billion surplus for the next fiscal year, which begins July 1st. The governor proposed socking most of the money away in a rainy day fund whose creation he pushed for in 2014. Nearly 70% of the state's projected revenue of about $135 billion next fiscal year is derived from personal income taxes, according to the governor's office. The state's fiscal health. And then they go on through this whole thing with the Wall Street Journal. But, you know, the bottom line, Brownback destroys Kansas. Governor Kay, what's her name, in Iowa, destroys Iowa. Republicans are destroying states all over the United States. We call, you know, Jefferson referred to states as laboratories of democracy. Well, they're certainly laboratories of something. And that's how bad it is. David in Lawrenceville, Georgia. Hey, David, thanks for listening to SiriusXM. What's on your mind today?
Thank you, Tom, for taking my call.
Sure.
You and Professor Wolf were speaking of China and its move towards being a superpower, economic superpower. I just wanted you to, if you could, speak to my understanding that China in the last decade or so have been buying a lot of gold, that their yen is backed by gold now.
No, it's not true. The yuan and the renminbi are fiat currencies, just like the dollar. China has a lot of gold, you're right, and they've been buying more gold. Price of gold is going up. It's a reasonable investment. It's a store that can be used. In some countries, you know, you trade in gold. I think that's probably largely dead, but the yuan and the renminbi are not backed by gold. Okay, and their intent is not to back their yuan by gold? No country would do that. It's a crazy thing to do. If you back your currency with gold, let's say that the U.S. dollar was backed with gold, and the U.S. economy grows by 2%. If the economy has grown by 2%, you need 2% more dollars in the economy to accommodate that growth, right? So if you're going to have 2% more dollars, that means you need 2% more gold. Where do you get that gold? You buy it from somebody else. You take the country's wealth and hand it off to, say, South Africa, where they mine a lot of gold, and get your gold but you can't use that for anything. You got to keep it in Fort Knox, and it stifles economic growth, and it ruins your ability to respond to recessions or, frankly, to really good times. And that's why Nixon closed the gold window in '71. It's actually why FDR, by and large, took us off the gold standard in the '30s, and why China has never gone to the gold standard.
Interesting. Is also China then the petrodollar and the petro yuan? Are they trying to convert oil to be exchanged with the dollar and transfer that to yuan, or that's not being touched at all?
Yeah, they're working on that, David. They're working on that. Whichever country owns the what's referred to as the reserve currency of the world, right now it's the dollar, which is basically that currency is used for the most critical commodity on Earth right now, because pretty much transportation, food, everything depends on it, which is oil. And so whatever country controls the currency that is used to trade oil among other countries has a tremendous advantage over any other country's currency, because it's an essential currency. Your country, if you want to buy or sell oil, you have to have dollar reserves. So, there's dollars in use. I mean, the U.S. economy is substantial, but the dollars in use all around the world are substantially larger than the U.S. economy, and it's because of oil. So if China can displace us, and frankly, Saudi Arabia talked about doing this a few years back. I think they've put that on hold. But if China can use the yuan to replace the dollar as the reserve currency for exchanging oil, they give a huge boost to the stability and reach of their currency, because countries all over the world are going to have to start having large foreign reserves of yuan.
Yes. And where would that put the United States if they do that?
SOL. We'd be in deep trouble. It would be a big problem for us. It would create a major recession in the United States, maybe even a depression. It would whack the dollar, basically, which would make all imports into, when the value of the dollar goes down, imports coming into the United States become more expensive, and our exports get less. Wait a minute. Let me make sure I've got this right. Yeah, when the value of the dollar goes down, our exports become less expensive, but our imports become more expensive, which in the economy of 1980 would have been a good thing, because we were a net exporter when Ronald Reagan came into office. And so we would make more money from our exports, and our imports would cost us more, but that would just give an advantage to American manufacturers. But the fact of the matter is that now you walk into any retail store and try to find even 1% of the items in that store that are made in the United States. Good luck with that, right? And so the net effect would be that while this would have been a good thing prior to the Reagan administration, when Reagan left office in 1988, we had completely flipped. We had gone from being the world's largest creditor to being the world's largest debtor, and the world's largest exporter to being the world's largest importer. I mean, Reaganomics literally flipped the American economy upside down and put us at the mercy of China and all these other countries. And we're seeing the consequences of that, the fruit of that now play out. So in today's economy, as dependent as we are on imports, and this was part of my rant in the first hour where I was talking about how if we had a serious flu epidemic, we are in big trouble because we don't make Tamiflu. We don't make antiviral drugs in the United States. They're made in China and India and Japan. And so if world trade starts breaking down, or if the value of our currency goes to hell, well, actually, that would help the imports. But it's like these are the reasons why it was a huge mistake to go with this whole neoliberal idea of so-called free trade. We need fair trade, reasonable trade, which is what we had for years and years. So that's that. David, I got to move along, but thank you for the call, and thanks for the great questions. Those were brilliant. Dan in Santa Clara, California. Hey, Dan, it says you want to disagree with me. What's up?
Yeah, hey, first off, preface, I'm a Democrat, a union leader. I've negotiated contracts, and what you're talking about is off of an article out of the Sacramento Bee in November 16th. It talks about a projected surplus, not a real surplus.
Right, that's next year's surplus. Yeah, there's a surplus this year, though.
Well, I'll have to verify that. I'll take your word for it. But what they're saying is that there's a projected surplus, and then it also talks in the article about how they're planning to spend that surplus. And this is my problem. When there's a surplus, we always want to spend more than we bring in. And that's why I'm a retired CalPERS firefighter. And that's why our retirement system is screwed up, because I'm a Democrat, because we spend or promise more than what we can deliver.
No, your retirement service, Dan, is screwed up because during the Reagan administration they changed the rules on how pensions work and how pensions are protected, and including state governments had gained the ability, at least at the federal level, to play games with their pensions that would have been illegal before Reagan.
That's not true, because I dealt with contracts intimately. This is what happens: is when investments in CalPERS exceeded the projected actuarials, the surpluses, then the money that was surplus based on projections was sent back to the cities into their general fund and spent. No financial consultant would ever advise their customer to spend their savings based on only actuarials. So that's not because of Reagan.
No, I'm telling you, it was the changes in pension laws in the 80s that allowed that sort of thing. And I can't verify that what you're saying is true, but I'm not disbelieving you. What I would submit is to you is that passing that money back, that the money should have been stored, right? I don't disagree with that, but okay. So the tax.
Am I right?
Well, I don't know. I don't know the details of it, but
the mayor said.
San
Francisco, Democrats. City of Salinas, where I work, Democrats. City of San Jose, one of the biggest cities in the country.
Right, and they're all doing really well. They're all doing really well. The pension funds are in trouble in some cases, and those pension funds would not. I stand by this, Dan. Those pension funds would not be in trouble if it weren't for the changes in pension rules made during the Reagan administration. We'll be right back. It's 15 minutes before the hour.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann. Visit ThomHartmann.com for audio and video archives.
We'll be back with more of your calls and the news of the day. Actually, we're going to check in with Talk Media News and Bob Nate, too, in about 5 minutes. Stick around. And welcome back. Let's see here. Charles in Hopewell, Virginia. Hey, Charles, what's on your mind?
Hey, Tom. How you doing?
Good.
All right. Look, I'm calling to find out whether or not you were able to see a recording of the way that the Virginia delegates were chosen last Thursday.
I saw the clips that circulated on television. You're talking about the runoff race that ended up in a tie after the Republicans challenged one vote and ended up with them drawing film cans out of a box or something?
Yes.
Yeah, I saw that.
Okay. So did you see? Okay. My problem with that was when before they placed the name of the Democrat in the canister, they folded her name, and it didn't take but a few seconds. When they did the Republican, it seems like it took much longer. So now I don't know whether or not the longer it took, it was going to make it a little heavier or a little lighter, so that when the person who pulled, he scattered the two in the bowl, and then he pulls this guy's name.
Yeah.
So now I'm saying that it just seems like every time a Republican and a Democrat, there's an issue between the two, the Republican always wins.
Yeah, they always figure out a way to put their thumb on the scale. It may be, Charles, the thing that concerns me a hell of a lot more than that is the fact that in the months prior to the election, where that race was a dead tie, I mean, literally the exact same number of people on both sides voting for those two candidates, that in the months before the election, 38,000 voters in Virginia were removed from the voting rolls. So when they showed up at the polls, they were given placebo ballots, provisional ballots, which are never counted or very rarely counted. And as a consequence of that, and a lot of people weren't even given placebo ballots, they were simply turned away. And the vast majority of the people who were removed from the polls were people with Hispanic, Black, or Asian last names. And so I would submit to you that the theft of the election in Virginia happened by controlling who could vote which has a long tradition that goes back to the founding of this republic, and preventing slaves from voting, and then preventing, or excuse me, women from voting, and then preventing freed slaves from voting during Reconstruction. That right up to the 1960s. That this is simply an extension of that. This is Jim Crow is still alive and well, and that is the just like. Donald Trump winning in Michigan after Rick Snyder throws over 100,000 people off the voting rolls. Donald Trump, and Trump wins by what, 10,000 votes roughly. In Wisconsin, he wins by 20,000 votes more or less. And Scott Walker threw a couple 100,000 people off the voting rolls. In Ohio, they threw hundreds of thousands of people off the voting rolls. In Indiana, in Pennsylvania, every single one of these states. I would submit to you, Charles, that the election was rigged before it was held.
Yes.
And we really need to be paying attention to that.
It just seems to me that, with all of that, and I'm aware of all of that, Tom, they get it close so that they can steal it.
Yeah. Look at 2000 with George W. Bush. He had a 500,000 fewer votes. I mean, if the Supreme Court was going to decide that election, what they should have done was said, the Electoral College is all screwed up. We can't figure out which one of these guys won in Florida. We're gonna call it for Al Gore because he got 500,000 more votes than George W. Bush. And just done away with the Electoral College. They had the ability to do it. They didn't. Instead, they handed it to the Republican in a 5-4 decision, all 5 Republican appointees. Charles, thanks for the call. Great to hear from you, and great topic. We'll be right back. Bob Ney is with us, coming up next.
Hi, I'm Heather with Free Speech TV. Your support, whether through giving of donations, volunteering, or even spreading the word, has made it possible for the only independent progressive news network to sustain for more than 20 years. Now, you can give to Free Speech TV through the Branch of Gratitude. This program is a sustainable way to give that reduces waste through paper mailing, postage, and staff hours. By choosing to participate in the Branch of Gratitude, you are joining hands with the socially conscious community and sending a message to the world that Free Speech TV is not only here to stay, it is here to thrive. Please call 877-378-8669 or go online to freespeech.org. Make a difference and join the Branch of Gratitude today.
I'm Nina Turner, and you're watching Free Speech TV.
Back. Let's check in with Talk Media News and find out what's going on in the world today. This report brought to you by goatsfortheoldgoat.com, Ellen Ratner's charity, and that provides goats to people in South Sudan and in some cases in famine regions. And her new book, Loving What You Do. Bob Ney is on the line with us, the author of Sideswiped. Former Republican congressman from Ohio, now reporter with Talk Media News Service. Bob, it's great to have you back. Bob?
Can you hear me now?
I hear you now.
Maybe that helps if I unmute this.
Yes, there you go. Magic trick.
Or maybe it's better if I keep it like that.
No, I like your voice.
All right,
so, Bob, what's going on in the world today?
Well, the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, better known as FISA, has passed the House, 256 to 164. Had a little bit of a cliffhanger. The president decided to get on his Twitter, shock, and, of course, said basically, to rephrase or paraphrase, said that, this is the court that, went after his campaign people, et cetera. Nancy Pelosi then, I think, did something, it was a good move. She went to Paul Ryan and said, pull the bill. Obviously, the president's not for it.
Right.
And then the president's press secretary, of course, walked back, comments and said, well, he's talking, he wants to go after the bad guys. He's talking about when they unmask citizens, which is the practice of the name coming out that was maybe involved with a foreign entity. So after that bit of drama, it did pass. Now it goes on to the Senate. There was a USA Rights.
If I may, Bob, interject something here. We now know that the reason Trump tweeted that tweet that almost blew up that legislation was because he watched a Fox and Friends segment that told him that.
Oh, really? I
Yes.
didn't know that.
Yeah, it preceded his tweet by a few minutes.
Okay. Well, he just about pulled everything off.
This is Rupert Murdoch making U.S. policy.
That's amazing. Thank you. I'd like to use that in my next call-ins if I could.
Yeah, sure.
With the other radio stations.
Yeah, it's all over the internet right now. Yeah.
And so there's the Senate Republican leadership in general won't want to make changes, but I must say Rand Paul, combined with some members on the Democratic side, Rand Paul's threatened a filibuster, could make maybe some changes. There was a USA Rights Amendment, dealing with Americans in the FISA court. Of course, the FISA court came into being. Now, this is a 6-year reauthorization, by the way, which honestly, I think, just in analyzing this, they would have been better off if they had made it a 2-year reauthorization instead of 6 years if there are problems. But the court was established because, of the Patriot Act, so a lot of people voted for it. Frankly, I voted against Patriot Act, but I did vote for the court because it was, quote, better than nothing. You know what I mean? Yeah. There's a lot of flaws in the system, so it didn't get changed in the House, although there were an attempt for a USA Rights Amendment and also a transparency amendment. And again, none of that was able to come up.
I'm guessing how lopsided the vote was in the House that it'll pass the Senate without a problem.
I think so. Again, Rand Paul's going to make an issue of a filibuster, but at some point.
Yeah, he's grandstanding. He wants to be president.
Yeah, right. He's going to grandstand on it. And then shifting to DACA, which the Dreamers has been absolutely amazing. Watching the president have that 55-minute deal that they had. I've been over the White House with a lot of people, as members do. Tom, you go in, they bring in the media. Media goes out, and then you have conversations. In this case, it was kind of amazing to see them let the media be in there for 55 minutes, unscripted in a sense. But the conventional wisdom is that he was trying to push back against Michael Wolff's book that he was an idiot, and so he was trying to display to the world how brilliant he was as a negotiator, and it didn't quite work out that way. Well, the details, when they come forth, obviously he didn't know a lot of details. Now
he didn't even know what a clean bill is.
Well, right.
And he's been president for 11 months.
But he said he would take a clean bill, which meant his wall wouldn't be in the bill.
Right, right. And he didn't know that. It's like, it was a breathtaking display of ignorance about the legislative process from the guy who's the president of the United States. I mean, what's wrong with this picture, Bob?
Right. Now, some people say that want the Dreamers legislation say, well, this took some pressure off it because the president's willing to do this or that, and because of the judge in California. But the government is going to fight the judge in California.
Yeah.
So I don't think this issue is, by any stretch of imagination, that the pressure is really off, on this particular issue. I would note to you, though, and I'm maybe trying to read between the lines here, but I know of a couple of the Democratic senators that sort of on some radio shows that I did today, but sort of came out and mentioned they might be able to support some kind of electronic device or some kind of fence or whatever. So I'm just starting to read between the lines that Trump would call it a wall, and whoever supports it would not call it a wall. You're starting to see that.
Do you know how many years it's been, Bob, that we've had negative migration? My recollection is it's at least 3. That the majority, that more people are going out of the United States who are not here legally. More people are leaving the United States than coming into the United States. Do you know how long it's been? It's definitely the case. It was definitely the case last year. I wonder, it seems to me that what ICE did yesterday in busting 7-Elevens, if they prosecute the employers, I think it's terrible that they're going after the employees. They're the victims. But if they prosecute the employers, I think that's going to have more impact than any wall ever could.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Anyhow, Bob, we're out of time. I'm sorry. Bob Ney with Talk Media News, author of Sideswipe. Brilliant book. Bob, thank you.
Thank you so much, Tom.
Great talking. We'll be right back.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann.
The Thom Hartmann Program is brought to you in part by the Aiden Forecast, an investment newsletter with weekly updates of leading market indicators and a monthly deep dive into what the details of the economy and the markets mean for investors and retirees. On the web at aidenmarkets.com.
Wines have some of the highest pesticide levels in our food chain. This hour brought to you by ecowine.com. Pesticide-free wines, organic wines, imported from France by the Organic Wine Company, ecowine.com.
Hartmann Program is brought to you in part by Super Beets. Super Beets are sourced from non-GMO beets, and they're packed with dietary nitrates, helping to produce nitric oxide for more energy, stamina, and support for healthy blood pressure levels naturally. For more information, call 800-223-8242 or visit tomsbeets.com. It's the Thom Hartmann University Book Club. Today we're reading from Elizabeth Colbert's book, The Sixth Extinction, An Unnatural History. This is from the prologue. Beginnings, it's said, are apt to be shadowy. So it is with this story, which starts with the emergence of a new species, perhaps 200,000 years ago. The species does not yet have a name, nothing does, but it has the capacity to name things. As with any young species, this one's position is precarious. Its numbers are small and its range restricted to a slice of eastern Africa. Still, its population grows, but quite possibly, when it contracts again, some would claim near fatally, to just a few thousand pairs. The members of the species are not particularly swift or strong or fertile. They are, however, singularly resourceful. Gradually, they push into regions with different climates, different predators, and different prey. None of the usual constraints of habitat or geography seem to check them. They cross rivers, plateaus, mountain ranges. In coastal regions, they gather shellfish. Farther inland, they hunt mammals. Everywhere they settle, they adapt and innovate. On reaching Europe, they encounter creatures very much like themselves, but stockier and probably brawnier, who have been living on the continent far longer. They interbreed with these creatures and then, by one means or another, kill them off. The end of this affair will turn out to be exemplary. As the species expands its range, it crosses paths with animals twice, 10, even 20 times its size. Huge cats, towering bears, turtle as big as elephants, sloths that stand 15 feet tall. These species are more powerful and even fiercer, but they are slow to breed and thus are wiped out. Although a land animal, our species, ever inventive, crosses the sea. It reaches islands inhabited by evolution's outliers, birds that lay foot-long eggs, pig-sized hippos, giant skinks. Accustomed to isolation, these creatures are ill-equipped to deal with the newcomers or their fellow travelers, mostly rats. Many of them, too, succumb. The process continues in fits and starts for thousands of years until the species, no longer new, has spread to practically every corner of the globe. At this point, several things happen more or less at once that allow Homo sapiens, as it has come to call itself, to reproduce at an unprecedented rate. In a single century, the population doubles. Then it doubles again, and then again. Vast forests are raised. Humans do this deliberately in order to feed themselves. Less deliberately, they shift organisms from one continent to another, reassembling the biosphere. Meanwhile, an even stranger and more radical transformation is underway. Having discovered subterranean reserves of energy, humans begin to change the composition of the atmosphere. This, in turn, alters the climate and the chemistry of the oceans. Some plants and animals adjust by moving. They climb mountains and migrate toward the poles. But a great many, at first hundreds, then thousands, and finally perhaps millions, find themselves marooned. Extinction rates soar, and the texture of life changes. No creature has ever altered life on a planet in this way before, and yet other comparable events have occurred. Very, very occasionally in the distant past, the planet has undergone change so wrenching that the diversity of life has plummeted. 5 of these ancient events were catastrophic enough that they're put in their own category, the so-called Big Five. What seems like a fantastic coincidence, but is probably no coincidence at all, the history of these events is recovered just as people come to realize that they're causing another one. When it's still too early to say whether it will reach the proportions of the Big Five, it becomes known as the sixth extinction. The story of the sixth extinction, at least as I've chosen to tell it, comes in 13 chapters. Each tracks a species that is in some way emblematic. The American mastodon, the great auk, an ammonite that disappeared at the end of the Cretaceous alongside the dinosaurs. The creatures in the early chapters are already gone. And this part of the book is mostly concerned with the great extinctions of the past and the twisting history of their discovery, starting with the work of the French nationalist Georges Cuvier. The second part of the book takes place very much in the present, in the increasingly fragmented Amazon rainforest, on a fast-warming slope in the Andes, and on the outer reaches of the Great Barrier Reef. I chose to go to these particular locations for the usual journalistic reasons, because there was a research station or because someone invited me to tag along on an expedition. Such is the scope of the changes now taking place that I could have gone pretty much anywhere, and with the proper guidance, found signs of them. One chapter concerns a die-off happening more or less in my own backyard and quite possibly in yours. If extinction is a morbid topic, mass extinction is, well, massively so. It's also a fascinating one. In the pages that follow, I try to convey both sides, the excitement of what's being learned, as well as the horror of it. My hope is that readers of this book will come away with an appreciation of the truly extraordinary moment in which we live. And then jumping to page 15. The same way acoustical engineers speak of background noise, biologists talk about background extinction. In ordinary times, times here understood to mean whole geological epochs, extinction takes place only very rarely, more rarely than even than speciation, and it occurs at what's known as the background extinction rate. This rate varies from one group of organisms to another. Often it's expressed in terms of extinctions per million species years. Calculating the background extinction rate is a laborious task that entails combing through whole databases worth of fossils. And then she goes on to talk mammals, it's about 0.25 per million species years. So on. The book, The Sixth Extinction by Elizabeth Colbert.
Beginning dip into it.
This is the Thom Hartmann Program.
Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you, and on the line with us, this is going to be fascinating. On the line with us is Lisa Rosenberg, the executive director of Open the Government. OpenTheGovernment.org is the website, and you can tweet her at Lisa RosenBRG or at OpenTheGov. Lisa, welcome to the program.
Thank you for having me.
Thanks for joining us. So the House of Representatives just passed the new FISA bill, and it's going to the Senate where Rand Paul is threatening to filibuster it. What is, first of all, what is this bill, number one? Number two, how is it different from previous bills, if at all? And then number three, of course, the big topic, what does it mean for us?
Sure. So the FISA bill, or the Foreign Intelligence Surveillance Act, is a bill that was enacted and designed to help our intelligence communities detect foreign national security threats. The problem with this bill is a section that's known as Section 702. But what that bill does is when the intelligence agencies collect information of communications, emails, cell phone conversations, et cetera, from foreign people who they have reason to believe may be engaged in terrorist activities. They're also often collecting communications of U.S. citizens. So if you're talking on the phone or emailing somebody abroad and that person is swept up in this foreign intelligence gathering, then you, as a U.S. citizen, your communications are also going to be swept up and kept in this massive database.
Yeah, which I do on a daily basis. Two of the people who work on this show are based overseas. It's amazing.
Right, and if they're in that database, then you're in that database. And then the problem, from our perspective, is that then your information, your communications can be searched. The FBI can go into that database and look for information about you without a warrant, with absolutely no Fourth Amendment protections whatsoever. The bill that passed today really didn't do much to change that. They sort of tweaked around the edges a little bit, but basically it's the same bill that's been in law, the same provision that's been in law for many years now. But this time there was a real push to put some limits on what the FBI could do. also require the FBI to have a warrant so that, those constitutional protections would apply to you and me. But unfortunately, the House that voted today, despite, like I said, an effort to amend this provision, that went down, and the House voted to pass basically the same provision that has been enacted or in law for a number of years.
Politicians both. I'm sorry.
That's okay. Our problem from we advocate for transparency, for accountability. We believe the government's more accountable, if it is transparent, if the citizens know what's going on. In addition to just ignoring our Fourth Amendment rights, the problem with this bill is, you as a citizen, you're not going to know if the FBI or other law enforcement are even using this database to get information about you. You have no way to really defend yourself or say it's inaccurate, or you don't even know if it's being used. And we think that's a real problem with accountability.
Yeah, it certainly flies in the face of due process. We've seen in so many other realms of American policy, whether it's foreign policy, whether it's domestic policy, a situation where policies that are even broadly agreed on among Democrats and Republicans, like, for example, drug prices should come down, get blown up because of corporate lobbying. In the case of Medicare Part D, it's illegal now for Medicare to negotiate drug prices, to buy in bulk at a lower price and then distribute those savings and those drugs to Medicare recipients. It's illegal because of the lobbyists, because lobbyists got in on the act and basically bought the votes of both Democrats and Republicans. I mean, the Medicare Part D was, I think, a classic example of that. To what extent, and we've been hearing for years now, I mean, particularly since the Patriot Act got rolled out right after 9/11, but I would say going back a decade, throughout my entire lifetime, in fact, we've been hearing from both Democrats and Republicans that they're concerned about civil liberties, they're concerned about the Fourth Amendment, they're concerned about government overreach. At the same time, we know, or I believe we know, correct me if I'm wrong on these numbers, that almost half of the NSA budget these days, or the intelligence budget, is going to private for-profit corporations, like the company that Ed Snowden worked for. And I'm assuming that those companies are very involved in this information gathering and sorting and whatnot. To what extent is the failure of the Republican Party, outside of a few libertarians like Justin Amash and Rand Paul, and the Democratic Party, by and large, which mounted some resistance to this in the House, but not enough. I mean, they didn't have the numbers to ever have enough, but you know what I'm talking about here. There were still Democrats who voted for this. To what extent are the people who are voting for this doing so because they're being lobbied by corporations that are making a profit off messing with our privacy, frankly?
Look, I think the lobbying expenditures by the national or by the security industry, the defense industry are astronomical. There's no question about that. And frankly, as a transparency and accountability organization, we want more transparency around those lobbying efforts. We want to know who those lobbyists are meeting with. Who are they talking to? And what are they saying?
And who are they giving money to, and how much?
And we have a sense, certainly, because of campaign finance disclosure laws, of where the money is coming from. So you could probably do a link between some of these, these corporations involved in national security, in the national security industry, and then, link them up with members of Congress and kind of see if there's any correlation between the vote. I think, though, the other piece of it is just, members of Congress are really hesitant to kind of open the door to anything that might look like they are less than 110% strong on defense. There is nothing that anybody is advocating in this bill that would make us less secure from foreign threats. None of the amendments that are being offered, none of the bills that are being offered have anything actually at all to do with what we can do to investigate potential foreign threats. It's not about what's going on outside of our borders or, with the threats that we're watching over, that may be involved in terrorism. That is not what we're talking about here. What we are talking about here, what we've tried to fix here and what we haven't, is, again, whether U.S. citizens are being targeted without a warrant.
Which brings us back to the
national security.
Right, which brings us back to the argument that was made during the Patriot Act, and in the mid 2000s, in the first decade of the century, that you know, what are you going to do if you've got somebody who, say, you know, their parents are Saudis, but they were born in the United States, they're U.S. citizens, and they've decided, and I shouldn't pick on Saudi Arabia, it's not unique to that country, but you know, somebody from that region where ISIS and the theology that inspires ISIS, which would be more Saudi Arabia, would be more ISIS coming out of, say, Syria or something, or Iraq, decides inside the United States, a U.S. citizen decides that they're going to join ISIS and, you know, blow up Times Square or something. Does this inhibit our ability to prevent domestic acts of terrorism?
This has nothing, the concern that we're focused on has nothing to do with domestic acts of terrorism. The concern we're focused on really is the FBI going to be going through this database, for example, at the direction of Jeff Sessions, who, you know, has recently announced that he is going to more strongly enforce federal marijuana laws, federal drug laws, you know, a reversal from the Obama administration, even in states that have legalized marijuana. The concern has nothing to do with terrorism. The concern has to do with whether the FBI is going to use this database to find any kind of evidence of, you know, illicit or illegal drug use, and then go after people for that. So that is
wow.
It's not about terrorism. Our concern is about truly unrelated civil or U.S. crimes that are unrelated to terrorism.
That's incredible. So I sent an email to Nigel, you know, my webmaster in the UK, about anything, and now they're on my email account, and then I sent a note to my wife saying, you know, want to smoke some pot tonight, and boom, I get busted by Jeff Sessions. Incredible. Lisa Rosenberg, thank you. You're brilliant. Hang on just a second, Lisa. Thank you.
Thom Hartmann Program.
The website is openthegovernment.org, and you can tweet Lisa at Lisa Rose, ROSENBRG, or at openthegov. We'll be right back. And welcome back, David in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania. Hey, David, what's on your mind today? It says here you disagree with me. What do you want to take me to task for this time?
Right. I just heard recently, just before the young lady was on, you were mentioning about California being, you know, the land of milk and honey because their taxes are so high. So I actually went myself to find out for true. And I have an article right here in front of me. It says, I'm reading it right off. It says, new figures from the U.S. Census Bureau show California has the highest poverty rate, with nearly 1 in 5 residents facing economic hardship when factoring in living costs such as housing. They have a 20.4% poverty rate, the highest in the country.
I would guess that would be relative to housing value.
The land of flowing taxes.
Yeah, David, I would guess that would be relative to the cost of housing in California. But the fact of the matter is, David, and I'm guessing you're going to, you know, whimper about this, but the reality is that if you are the working poor in California, if you're one of those people who are living in poverty, you have free access to medical care. Medicaid was expanded. If you're one of the working poor in Mississippi, Alabama, or frankly, pretty much any other Republican-controlled state, you are screwed. You are just plain old SOL. You got nothing. You get to die.
Well, may I go down farther? It says here, they have it listed here as the supplemental poverty measure, which is looks at the burden placed on households such as housing, taxes, and medical costs. Without considering cost of living, you're right, California ranks at 14.5%.
Because they're wealthy, they're the wealthiest in the nation. David, the comparison you're making,
the average.
No, David, the comparison you're making, it would be like saying, well, you know, Mexico has, you know, lower taxes and therefore everything is wonderful there. Why don't we just all move to Mexico? If you're arguing, David, that people in California are worse off than people in Louisiana, I don't think anybody's going to buy that.
I'm just stating what the U.S. Census Bureau.
No, what you're doing is you're taking some U.S. Census Bureau numbers and you're putting them into a right-wing frame. And I'm guessing that the source of your information is probably some article on Breitbart or the Wall Street Journal. And it's called cherry-picking data. I'm not buying it. Peter in Winter Haven, Florida. Hey, Peter, what's on your mind today?
Hey, Tom. So I became a precinct committee person here in Florida. It's
good
red
on you.
County. Thank you. It's a red county, but even though there are more Democrats here by a little margin, the voter turnout is heavily Republican, and it's run by Republicans in pretty much every level of the government. So the funny thing is, I registered as a Democrat, and about a month later, I received mail from the election office stating that, very general, we have received information that you may no longer live at the address listed on your voter record, so please confirm it.
You got caged.
So I thought of not doing it and just to see what happens, just to monitor it. But then I decided to just send the damn letter back because I'm getting involved in politics and I don't want to have to go through this. But I thought this was it. Only a month later after I registered.
Was it sent to you from the government itself or from one of the political parties?
From the Polk County Commission.
Yeah. See, the Republicans control government in Florida, so they're doing caging, and this is what the Supreme Court yesterday gave them permission to do. That's amazing. Peter, thank you for the call. We'll be right back. Stick around. It's 20 minutes past the hour. Welcome back. Thom Hartmann here with you. Somebody on Twitter pointed out that when I said only 4% of Americans have passports, I was wrong. And that person is right. And I was wrong. And I tweeted out an article. It's an older one. It's by William Chalmers from 2012 from Huffington Post that lays it out. You know, they're basically about half of us, a little less than 47% of Americans. No, excuse me, 42% of Americans are passport holders. Number one. A lot of those are passport holders because they started out as foreign nationals. I mean, we're talking about something like 40 million people. 40 million foreign-born U.S. residents. Well, all of them. I mean, if you're born in another country, you come to the United States, you become a citizen, you get a passport. But but I was talking about that in the context of travel. And so if you look at the statistics, what you find. Hang on just a second here. The real story is that when broken down, approximately the 25 million trips overseas were taken by 13.3 million American residents. That means in total, the real number of Americans who actually traveled overseas for business or leisure was about 15 million, or just 5% of our nation's 300 million residents. And my apologies, it may well be that what I was remembering is that only 5% of Americans, I thought it was 4%, travel overseas. Then that number is solid, but having passports, I was wrong on that. I apologize. Thank you for the correction to whoever it was on Twitter, and try to keep the show honest here. Aaron in Dubuque, Iowa. Hey, Aaron. It says here you want to tell me I'm wrong. Jeez, get a lot of these today. What's up?
Hi, Tom. Thanks for taking my call. No, I'm not calling to take you to task or anything. It's just really important that we get some truth about our currency out to the public in general. The reason I'm calling is in response to your guest, Richard Wolff, who had stated that if China decides to stop lending us money, we're going to be in big trouble. China does not lend us not $1. We are a monetarily sovereign nation and the sole issuers of our currency. So while we have some treasury flipping back and forth between China, the only place that our currency comes from is from us. We're, like I said, monetarily sovereign. We have a fiat currency. There's no one that has the power or the ability to lend us our money because we are the only people who can issue it or create it.
Aaron, what you're laying out, and doing so brilliantly, by the way, thank you, is modern monetary theory. And you're absolutely right. The problem is a practical problem. The problem is that in our administration, in the Trump administration, in the Obama administration before that, in every administration, you will find people who don't understand what you're talking about and don't agree with you. I'm down with the idea of, hey, let's issue some $1 trillion coins and pay off the national debt tomorrow if you wanted to. Although I think it's a good thing that we have our debt because that debt is actually private savings by and large. The largest holder of U.S. debt is American citizens, our American citizens. China's sitting on somewhere between 1 and 2 trillion, I believe, of U.S. Treasury debt. And arguably that's loaning us money. But in the practical world, in the real world, if China was to say, you know, setting aside the fact that, you know, we have a sovereign currency and we can literally bail ourselves out of this. It ain't going to happen, because if China was to say, okay, you know, we're just going to dump this $1 trillion worth of bonds into the bond market would explode. The U.S. would be thrown into recession, and there would be nothing that you and I could do about it, as clear as we understand that there actually is a solution to this. Aaron?
Our national debt is some 20 plus trillion that they're saying it is. When we create our currency, we create that currency from thin air. We do not owe thin air a debt. This is all a con job that has been perpetuated on the American public since we specifically or technically went off of the gold standard in 1971. We've been operating off of the gold standard since around about FDR in World War II, but we officially went off it in 1971. So after that, when we're no longer backed, when we create currency, we don't get it from anywhere.
No, I understand that. And about 90% of currency creation is from banks lending money to people.
Okay, but it's not money that anyone owes a debt on. Again.
Well, it's always, actually, it's always.
We create this currency from thin air. We do not owe thin air a debt. Our population, our society is going around thinking that the Federal Reserve...
Aaron, you've said this 3 times now. Do you disagree with me that if China dumped $1 trillion worth of U.S. bonds into the bond market, it would create chaos?
I'm not disagreeing with that, but the actual reality of that happening is this. It's like that's the straw man argument. The fact is that let's take the CHIP program. You have all of these legislators that are going about saying we can't afford it. We can't afford it. We're going to go broke. We can't afford it. Those are out-and-out lies. We cannot go broke because we are the sole issuers of our currency.
Yes.
So we've already kind of touched on national debt. Again, we don't owe a debt.
No, Aaron, I'm agreeing with you. What I'm saying is, I'm agreeing with you, Aaron. What I'm saying is that none of our politicians believe what you and I are saying.
But it doesn't matter what people believe.
It actually does. When they are in the Senate of the United States or in the House of Representatives, or they are the President of the United States, or they are advisors to same, it matters tremendously what they believe.
Okay, that's what they believe when it comes to safety net programs and programs for the people. But that's not what they believe when it comes to defense spending or pork.
No, it is. They're not willing. You know, they're equally not willing to issue currency out of nothing for the Defense Department. We're not, by and large, not doing that. We're taking tax dollars.
That $700 billion that was passed for the defense budget is all spending coming out of Congress has created currency. Taxes do not fund federal spending. We are not restrained by revenue. Taxes are deleted. I mean, we have all of this division in this country that's perpetuated on the fact that, oh, my tax dollars are going to this welfare queen, or I don't want my tax dollars to go for abortion, or my tax dollars are my tax dollars. Taxes do not fund spending. Congress issues the spending, the Fed and the Treasury dole it out, done. That's how spending happens in this country. We are not revenue constrained.
And there is not a politician in America who understands what you are saying, Aaron. Modern monetary theory is brilliant, and it's accurate, and it's right. But nobody in politics understands it. So, anyway, we'll be right back.
You're listening to the Thom Hartmann Program. Call 202-808-9925.
Back with more of your calls right after this.
Welcome to the Thom Hartmann University Book Club. Today we're reading from Crisis Without End. This is a collection of essays about nuclear power compiled by Helen Caldicott and edited by Helen Caldicott. I'm reading from the introduction which she wrote. She is the world-famous Australian pediatrician, physician who has been speaking out about nuclear power and whatnot for years and years. On March 11, 2011, an earthquake measuring 9 on the Richter scale struck off the east coast of Japan. Within days, the ensuing tsunami had induced the meltdown of 3 of the 6 nuclear reactors at the Fukushima Daiichi nuclear power plant. During the earthquake, the external power supply was lost to the reactor complex. The pumps that circulate up to 1 million gallons of water per minute to cool each reactor core ceased to function. Emergency diesel generators situated below the plants kicked in, but these were soon swamped by the tsunami. Without cooling, the radioactive cores in units 1, 2, and 3 began to melt within hours. Over the next few days, all 3 cores, each weighing up to 100 tons, melted their way through 6 inches of steel at the bottom of their reactor vessels and oozed their way onto the concrete floor of the containment buildings, a fact that the Japanese government and Tokyo Electric Power Company, TEPCO, the power plant operator, continued to deny for months after the disaster. At the same time, the zirconium cladding covering thousands of uranium fuel rods reacted with water to create hydrogen, which initiated hydrogen explosions in units 1, 2, 3, and 4. Massive quantities of radiation escaped into the air and water, 3 times more noble gases, argon, xenon, and krypton, than at the Chernobyl nuclear power plant accident in 1986, and huge amounts of other volatile and non-volatile radioactive elements, including cesium, tritium, iodine, strontium, silver, plutonium, americium, and rubidium. Fukushima is now described as the greatest industrial accident in history. The Japanese government considered plans to evacuate 35 million people from Tokyo as other reactors, including 4 at Fukushima Daini, several miles along the coast from Fukushima Daiichi, were also at risk. Meanwhile, thousands of people fled the area around the smoldering reactors, but they were not notified when the radioactive plumes were traveling, despite the fact that there was a system in place to track the plumes. As a result, people fled directly into regions with the highest radiation concentrations, where they were exposed to high levels of whole-body external gamma radiation, inhaling radioactive air, and swallowing radioactive elements. Administering inert potassium iodide to the exposed people would have blocked the uptake of radioactive iodine in the thyroid glands. Unfortunately, it was not supplied except in the town of Miharu, where there was a conscientious mayor. Prophylactic iodine was, however, distributed to the staff of Fukushima Medical University in the days following the accident, after extremely high levels of radioactive iodine, 1.9 million becquerels per kilogram, were discovered in leafy vegetables near the university. Iodine contamination was already widespread in leafy vegetables and milk, while other isotopic contamination from substances such as cesium was widespread in vegetables, fruit, meat, milk, rice, and tea in many areas of Japan. Fukushima disaster is not over and will not end for many millennia. The radioactive fallout, which has covered vast swaths of Japan, will remain toxic for hundreds of thousands of years. It cannot simply be cleaned up, and it will continue to contaminate food, humans, and animals. It is unlikely that the 3 Fukushima Daiichi reactors that experienced total meltdowns will ever be deassembled or decommissioned. TEPCO claims such a massive undertaking will take them at least 30 to 40 years. The International Atomic Energy Agency, IAEA, predicts that it will be more than 40 years before any progress can be made because of the dangerous levels of radioactivity at the damaged reactors. This accident is identical to the Chernobyl catastrophe in its medical implications. The Fukushima meltdowns will induce an epidemic of cancer as people ingest radioactive elements. The single meltdown and explosion at Chernobyl contaminated 40% of the European landmass. Already, according to a 2009 report published by the New York Academy of Sciences, over 1 million people have perished as a result directly of that catastrophe. Large parts of Europe will remain radioactive for hundreds of years, as will now be the case in Japan. In assessing the impact of the Fukushima disaster on Japan and on the planet, and in assessing the safety of nuclear power overall, it is imperative to understand and evaluate the biological and medical consequences of exposure to the kinds of radioactive elements that were released during an accident at a nuclear power plant. Fact 1, no dose of radiation is safe. Each dose received by the body is cumulative and adds to the risk of developing malignancy or genetic disease. Fact 2, children are 10 to 20 times more vulnerable to the carcinogenic effects of radiation than adults. Females tend to be more sensitive than males, while fetuses and immunocompromised patients are also extremely sensitive. Fact 3, high doses of radiation received from a nuclear meltdown or from weapons explosions can cause acute radiation sickness, including hair loss, severe nausea, diarrhea, and bleeding. Reports of these illnesses, particularly among children, appeared within the first few months after the Fukushima accident. And then it goes on, you know, the types of ionizing radiation. Crisis Without End by Helen Keller.
Hartmann.com/podcast. They're commercial free, and you can listen anytime, any place you want. Welcome back to the Thom Hartmann Program, the last half hour of our program. Michael in Santa Clarita, California. Hey, Michael, what's on your mind?
Hiya. Hey, I live out here in California, thinking of the guy that called in. And I don't want Louisiana.
Right.
We've got, costs do not equate to quality of life. We got it pretty good. It's just a ridiculous statement the gentleman was saying.
Yeah. So I don't disagree. although what's the Lincoln's old quote? Figures don't lie, but liars can figure.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. So, I mean, as you pointed out earlier, surplus, because the governor, the legislators raise taxes on the wealthy. Not a lot, but they raise a little bit, and we're doing pretty good out here. Yeah.
Yep, absolutely. And that on top of the fact that, as that article pointed out, California is facing some extraordinary expenses as a consequence of the disasters climate change has brought to them. You know, the wildfires, now you got mudslides, you've got, I mean, all these issues that have to do with our changing climate. But California is still producing a surplus, which is a good thing. Michael, thanks for the call. Well said. Thank you. Yeah. Thank you. Charles in Opelika, Florida. Hey, Charles, what's on your mind today?
How you doing? I'm thinking of Iran.
Okay.
And the Republicans, and going against. I'm just talking real bad about Obama's deal with Iran, and basically, what Obama did was stop them from having a boogeyman to run on when they go for elections. The Republicans, they can't use they wasn't able to use Iran in the last election, I think, as much as they did in 2012. And second of all, I think it's just big corporations, especially the oil corporations, that don't want the Iranian oil because it's competition on the market. Yeah.
That's interesting. I think I don't know about that, Charles, but the one thing that Americans really need to pay attention to, and I think this is the reason why Trump opened up all of our offshore waters to oil drilling, and why they're taking apart our national parks so that they can drill oil in them, is that up until last year, up until this year, it was against the law to export oil, crude oil from the United States. You could export refinery products, diesel fuel, gasoline, motor oil, but you couldn't export raw oil. And that was a rule that went into place during the Arab oil boycott back in the 70s. And I don't remember if it was the 73 crisis or the 78 crisis, but whatever it was in the 70s. And probably during the Carter administration, might have even been Nixon, passed a law saying you can't export oil anymore. It's too precious a commodity for national security and for our economy. And that got rolled back in the last year. And so now that these companies, whether it's Koch Industries or whether it's TransCanada, a Canadian company, or if it's, Dutch Royal Shell, or whether it's British Petroleum, whatever, these companies are able to come to the United States, drill for oil like crazy, and sell it outside the United States. That's the whole, one of the larger points of the whole TransCanada pipeline, was get that oil from Canada to the Gulf of Mexico, where it can be sold on international markets. We are now exporting oil. So basically what Trump is trying to do is turn us into a third world country, into a country that basically makes its living selling natural resources. And that's something that we've never done in the history of the United States. But Reaganomics, we started doing during the Reagan era, when we went from, for the first time since George Washington, being a net exporter to being a net importer. And, and we've been importing oil for quite some time, obviously. And I think that's the big issue that people need to be paying attention to. Charles, thanks for the call. David in Los Lunas, New Mexico. Hey, David, what's on your mind today?
Hey, Tom. I was just wondering, how do Iranian sanctions affect commodity oil prices?
The ending of the sanctions allowed Iran to sell oil in the open marketplace, and Iran can pump, I believe. Now I'm running from memory here, and it's an old memory. It might be a couple of years that I've seen these numbers, so don't take this to the bank. But I believe it's something on the order of something a little short of 1 million barrels a day, and if it's not enough to like flip markets, but it's enough to influence them by a percentage point or two. And so there are some who suggest that, some in the oil industry, who suggest that if Iranian oil exports were once again blocked, that would raise oil prices enough to make oil companies more profitable. And there is some suspicion that some of the funding, or at least encouragement, of the hard rights hatred of the Iran deal isn't just because Obama did it. It's because it's allowing Iran to sell oil on international markets, which is driving down the price of oil, which doesn't help the hard right government of Saudi Arabia, doesn't help the billionaires in the United States who make their money off oil, doesn't help the big oil companies. Make sense?
Yes, and it also doesn't help Russia. So therefore, bought and paid for Republican Congress.
Well, maybe. I mean, it doesn't.
Of Petrochem.
Yeah, I don't know that. I mean, Russia was a party to this deal. Russia is out there saying, we want to keep this deal. I think the extent to which the price of oil as a result of Iran selling oil in the international markets might be reducing profits in Russia. I'm guessing that when they look at that, they say, which is more important, making a little extra on our oil or having international stability, particularly in the oil-producing regions of the Middle East? And they have clearly, explicitly, like the Obama administration did, decided that it's more important to have stability and peace than it is to have high oil prices. I see no evidence that Russia is trying to change that or trying to blow up the Iran deal. The extent to which they may be helping the Republicans, I don't know. That evidence has not yet been released by the Mueller investigation, and I think we're all waiting to see it. But I think that this. Say what?
The Kochs, they would benefit.
Oh yeah, Koch brothers will benefit big time, and I see little evidence that. Well, not to speak specifically of the Kochs, but just generally. Business typically, I mean, it depends on the business. Consumer product businesses don't like war, but big businesses generally are not all that badly hurt by war. In fact, it provides them with tremendous business opportunities to buy up weaker competitors, opportunities to move into other marketplaces, opportunities to sell to government. War can be very profitable. In World War II, you had Franklin Roosevelt put in charge of his War Profiteering Commission a senator by the name of Harry Truman. And he had Harry Truman tracking down defense contractors who were making a profit on, or excessive profits, a profit over a certain percent, I forget what it was, having them go after, I'm not sure actually I ever knew what it was, but having them go after that. And Harry Truman, of course, then became vice president and then president. But since then, that was the last time that we had an administration that wanted to crack down on war profiteers in the military-industrial complex. And all the more the tragedy. David, thanks for the call. Chris in Littleton, Colorado. Hey, Chris, what's on your mind today?
Yeah, Tom, apropos of the previous caller on modern monetary theory, Milton Friedman was, I think, resigned to some of the realities of a living wage and how, especially with respect to your geographic location, that oftentimes that your skill set couldn't really meet the wages that you were earning, couldn't make ends meet. So he entertained the idea of, instead of a minimum wage hike, that you could do an earned income tax credit that would bring you up to the $15 an hour, and that you could dole it out in incremental kind of monthly deposits from the Treasury. And that's coming from a libertarian. So
yeah, what I missed was the name of the person. Hang on just a second, Chris. Who is the person who you say suggested this?
Milton Friedman.
Oh, yeah, of course. Okay. And basically what Friedman is describing there, which is the system that we have by and large, is a massive government subsidy for corporations that pay crap wages. I mean, that's the bottom line. Walmart is getting billions of dollars in subsidies through us giving food stamps to Walmart employees, us giving housing assistance to Walmart employees, us expanding Medicaid for Walmart employees. All of these kinds of subsidies, not to mention, earned income tax credits and things like that, all these kinds of subsidies for people who are working at poverty wages are simply enabling an economic system where big corporations only pay poverty wages, and the result of that is and they're not hurt by it. I mean, traditionally, when big corporations or even small corporations pay lousy wages, they end up either with lousy workers or no workers at all. But with these subsidies, these companies are able to get away with paying somebody $6, $8, $9, or $7, $8, $9, $10 an hour, and make out like bandits. And there's something just very, very, very fundamentally wrong with that. I'm not sure how to describe it beyond that, but there's just something terribly, terribly wrong with that situation. And it's something that, frankly, we should do something about. And I'm not saying that we should cut. Now, some Republicans will point this out, and they'll say, yeah, these are subsidies for big corporations. Therefore, let's do away with them. No more Medicaid, no more food stamps. Well, no, that's not the solution, because those programs also catch people who are disabled, who are caring for elderly parents or for disabled kids, who are trapped in horrible poverty in areas where there literally are no jobs, like Appalachia or many of our inner cities. Those programs are keeping people alive. But the extent to which there's subsidies to big business, that should be done away with. The way you do it is not by killing the programs. You do it by saying to big business, you've got to pay enough money to your people that they can afford housing and medicine and food, so that we no longer have to subsidize their housing, subsidize their medicine, and subsidize their food, because we're really subsidizing the big corporations. Coming up on 15 minutes before the hour, we'll be right back.
You're listening to Thom Hartmann. Visit ThomHartmann.com for audio and video archives.
More of your calls, 202-808-9925, right after this. And welcome back. Bob in Tahlequah, Oklahoma. Hey, Bob, what's on your mind today?
Hello, Tom. Good discussion.
Thank you.
Good year to you ahead, hopefully. The enigmatic economy versus the practical economy. You're talking about it. Lots of people are talking about it. Subsidies should be used in a democratic society of goodwill to close gaps between people, to fulfill needs that would otherwise be filled by themselves, or a functioning, practical economy that is grown from the ground up, not trickling down by finance. So the finance and the subsidies put forward, whether they be for corporations or for individual people, one area or another of a place, it should be to close gaps of need or to heal destruction that has taken place.
Right, but the point that I'm making, Bob, is that those gaps are created by corporations refusing to pay a living wage.
And I think you're spot on, and I think that the goodwill is missing and the honesty missing, and this convoluted, you wonder about the star, the upside down stars on the elephant. Well, it's very simple. That's the convoluted, that's a simple symbol to say, we're turning this thing on its head, and we're not going to pay any attention to genuine or honest or democratic. Game over. Rich people won. Now, I don't accept that. You don't accept that.
Right.
So we keep up the fight. Thank you, Tom.
You're welcome, Bob. And I think that we have to do more than just keep up the fight. We have to make it very, very clear to people that this is what's going on. And Louise, let me know once you, Louise, once you have the Telos software up, let me know. Just open the Telos software. close Neoscreener, open Telos. Until we actually say out loud what Bernie was saying during the last campaign constantly, and it never broke through in the corporate media because much of the corporate media is paying minimum wage, right, in many of their jobs. Until we say out loud, until we get a national consensus on this, until there's a broad agreement across the country that it is wrong with the way that corporate America is treating American workers, and say, these subsidies, these are not welfare programs for lazy people. These are subsidies for big corporations that want to pay crappy wages. It's just that simple. And the corporations have to start paying decent wages. American corporations right now are more profitable than at any time in the history of the United States. American corporations right now are sitting on more cash than at any time in the history of the United States. American corporations right now are able to borrow at a lower interest rate than any time in my lifetime. And yet those same corporations are saying, we can't pay decent wages to people and we need a tax cut. Come on, give me a break. This system is broken. We'll be right back.
Hi, I'm Heather with Free Speech TV. Your support, whether through giving of donations, volunteering, or even spreading the word, has made it possible for the only independent progressive news network to sustain for more than 20 years. Now, you can give to Free Speech TV through the Branch of Gratitude. This program is a sustainable way to give that reduces waste through paper mailing, postage, and staff hours. By choosing to participate in the Branch of Gratitude, you are joining hands with the socially conscious community and sending a message to the world that Free Speech TV is not only here to stay, it is here to thrive. Please call 877-378-8669 or go online to freespeech.org. Make a difference and join the Branch of Gratitude today.
I'm Nina Turner, and you're watching Free Speech TV.
You and we had a call system failure, and we just dumped one call screening software and brought up another. So if you were on hold and trying to get in and you got dumped, just feel free to call right back. We still have another, 7-8 minutes of the show left to go. Jody, Jody, I don't have a city for where you are.
I'm Tucson.
Tucson. Okay, what's up?
Okay, well, he wants us to pay for his wall with taxpayer money, plus it would take infrastructure for roads to get the materials there, and we need infrastructure so badly with our roads, bridges, electricity, et cetera, so I don't see why we have to pay for the wall. And the biggest part of immigration problem is not at the border, it's with overstaying visas and the people who employ them.
Yeah, like Donald Trump. I mean, what about all the foreign workers, white European foreign workers that Donald Trump brings in every year to staff Mar-a-Lago? It's like nobody's talking about that.
I know, they don't even say it on the news or anything. They don't push back on it. They just talk about, in general, the wall.
Yeah. Well, and the other thing about the wall is that the wall is infrastructure. Right?
That's what I said, yeah. Plus, they'd have to have infrastructure roads to drive those heavy trucks there with the materials.
Right, but it raises a really interesting question. Trump right now is promoting this idea that Gary Cohn, the Goldman Sachs guy who's his chief financial advisor, and others around him have been promoting for some time, which is that when we rebuild America's infrastructure, because it's been failing and falling apart and not being maintained ever since the Reagan administration, since Reagan cut taxes on wealthy people and corporations and stopped paying for American infrastructure. So we've got basically a 1985 infrastructure in 2018. The solution that they're proposing is this so-called public-private partnership, which sounds sweet, but really what it means is we're going to take the national infrastructure of the United States, our roads, our bridges, our sewer systems, our water systems, our electric systems, our you name it. We're going to take that infrastructure. We're going to give it to for-profit corporations. In exchange for that, we want them to upgrade it and maintain it, and then they maintain it and make a profit by charging us to use it. So basically everything gets turned into a toll. So if he's so big on public-private partnerships, if he wants to bring in investors to do infrastructure, why doesn't he bring in some friggin' investors to do the wall? Which raises, and the answer to that, by the way, is obvious why he doesn't, because there's no way you can generate a profit from the wall once it's there. You're not, unless you put a toll booth in the middle of it and say, okay, you got to jump over a 4-foot high, bar here, and once you do, you're in the United States. You pay us a $150 toll, and then ICE will catch you up the road or something. It's the only way I can think of that they would actually do something like that. And what that proves is that unless infrastructure can be used to toll people, in other words, unless infrastructure can be used to generate a profit for a for-profit corporation, there's going to be no public-private partnerships on much of America's infrastructure because it can't be converted into profits, just like the wall. And you would think that people would figure this out, but apparently not. Jody, thanks. That was a great comment, and well said. By the way, Donald Trump has been talking about how smart he is. I went to Wharton Business School, which implies that he's got an MBA from Wharton Business School. He doesn't. He's got a bachelor's degree in economics. No MBA, Donald. Karen in Houston, Texas. Hey, Karen, what's on your mind today?
Hi, Tom. I was listening to your discussion earlier on pension funds, and we have a big problem with pension funds here in Houston that has been brought under discussion. I wanted to know why the pension funds cannot sue the ratings agencies that took money to rate some subprime mortgage funds as AAA, which is what made them available for pension funds. And then when 2008 happened, of course, they lost their money, just like everybody else.
Yeah, what you're identifying is the real problem with CalPERS and pretty much every other pension fund in the United States, and that is that they were heavily invested in the market in 2007, which seemed like a common sense thing to do. The market was exploding from 2000 to 2007. But then, it was exploding because of the deregulation of the banks, and the banks were making all this funny money, and it collapsed in 2008. And the consequence.
That was obvious.
Yeah.
Because it was obvious to me, and I kept asking my friends, does anybody want to know about the upcoming collapse of the market?
All right.
And
I was talking about it. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
I was talking about it in 2007.
I don't understand, though, why nobody has sued.
I don't know.
They're reducing the pensions of all of these people all over the country.
It's a good question. It might be more difficult or more complex than you and I think, but I honestly don't know the answer to that question, Karen. It's a good one. Good question for somebody like Richard Wolff or maybe even Mark Pocan next week.
I'd love to have Richard Wolff talk about that.
Yeah, I'm with you. Karen, thanks a lot for the call. It's great to hear from you, and my apologies to everybody else who didn't get in. We will be back tomorrow with Anything Goes Friday. Thanks so much for being with us today. A lot going on in the world, a lot going on in our country. A lot of it we're not hearing about in much of our media, which is a real tragedy. So keep informed, keep active, get out there, get active, because democracy is not a spectator sport. Tag, you're it. We'll see you tomorrow.
You've been listening to Thom Hartmann. For audio and video archives, visit thomhartmann.com.
The Thom Hartmann Program is brought to you in part by the Aiden Forecast, an investment newsletter with weekly updates of leading market indicators and a monthly deep dive into what the details of the economy and the markets mean for investors and retirees. On the web at aidenmarkets.com.
Wines have some of the highest pesticide levels in our food chain. This hour brought to you by ecowine.com. Pesticide-free wines, organic wines, imported from France by the Organic Wine Company, ecowine.com.
Hartmann Program is brought to you in part by Super Beets. Super Beets are sourced from non-GMO beets, and they're packed with dietary nitrates, helping to produce nitric oxide for more energy, stamina, and support for healthy blood pressure levels naturally. For more information, call 800-223-8242
or visit tomsbeets.com.